Welcome to all. Today is a special day for us. Our guests are members of the project on transcultural histories of psychotherapy, and Sonu Shamdasani is the coordinator of the group. Sonu is a well-known historian of psychology, and he is professor of Jung history and directs the UCL Center for History of Psychological Disciplines. He is also the editor of the edition of the unpublished work of Jung, and he was the editor of the well-known Red Book. Now he introduced us the works of the day, and please, Sonu, welcome in Rome.
I would like to thank our hosts here, Marco Ponzi, Renato Foschi, and Marco Innamorati, for being, in a way, crazy enough to welcome us here in this collaborative project, not knowing what will happen. And I would also like to thank the UCL Global Engagement Office for co-sponsoring this event. The 20th century has seen new practices of speaking, listening, and writing. Speaking, listening, and writing. It sounds quite simple, but when you combine them and think about them in different ways, it rapidly gets more complex. So as Renato was indicating, for a few years now, we've been having a project of collaborative informal network exploring transcultural histories of psychotherapies, which is mainly focused on, in a way, speaking, listening, speaking and listening, listening and speaking. So for this event today, we are continuing to explore the intersection of these with speaking, listening and writing, and the intersection of practices of psychotherapies with literary intersections and the literary aspect of these practices. So in a way, these kind of three terms will kind of reappear in different guises, in different modalities throughout the talks. It's what links them together. In a way, links and separates, because it's not just simply a question of putting things together, but also looking at their divergence and thinking about ways in which we can, as students, as historians, look at how these practices have emerged and their complex interrelations. So I'd like to thank you for attending, also not knowing what craziness might ensue. It's a risk. It's a sunny day. There are many other things you could do, particularly if you're students wanting to do other things than study. So I pass back to Renato, who will chair the day.
Thank you. So, our first speakers is Rémy Amouroux. Rémy is adjunct professor at Lausanne University, and he is also he studied in Paris, and today he speaks about behavior therapy in France, and he works on archive of French behaviorism. So thank you, Rémy, for to be here.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizer also, because it's a very nice conference. We have already very nice experience of good food and good places. So thank you so much for that. It's already a success for me. I hope that it will be the case also for you. So I'm waiting for the PowerPoint. The title of my presentation is Behavior Therapy Through Letters and Postcards. I'm not sure that postcards are really literature, but I'm pretty sure that it's an original way to explore the history of psychotherapy. I would like to begin this presentation with a short anecdote. A few years ago, I was working as an assistant professor in the city of Brest, at a small university located in the far west French Brittany. I was going to leave France for Switzerland since I just had gotten another position in Lausanne, where I am now. And I learned a few weeks before leaving that Jacques Rognon, an unknown psychiatrist, was a pioneer of behavioral therapy. And he was just living a few blocks from my house. So I decided to contact him and ask him if by any chance he would discuss with me about the history of psychotherapy in France. He kindly accepted and offered me to visit him. I was very happy because I clearly hoped to ask him if by any chance I could have a look at his personal archives. Unfortunately, in the very beginning of the interview, he told me there's nothing left. I was a bit disappointed because I really wanted to have some things to work on. And he explained to me that a few years ago he destroyed everything, mainly for ethical reasons, because it was mainly exchange with patients and he didn't want to give them to historians. So anyway, the interview was quite interesting, and I quit. I leave Brittany and I leave France. And 1 year later, Rognon contacted me again and told me that he had just found some materials which could interest me maybe. So I was surprised. He told me that there was nothing left, and my amazement was even greater when I looked at the box. It was mostly letters, and more than half of them were from patients. My paper today will deal with those letters and use them as an original source to explore the history of psychotherapy. Moreover, I will also connect this specific history with a broader field of history of medicine by post. Also, the idea of the history of epistolary medicine, the use of letters in medicine. In this presentation, I will firstly briefly present both medicine by post and Jacques Rognon, and then using a case study, I will endorse the claim that using letters was both a necessity and a choice. A necessity since Rognon practiced psychiatry in Brest, a provincial city of France, far away from Paris. At that time it was more than 6 hours with a train to go there, so the patient was not easily reachable. And also a choice, which is interesting, because Rognon claimed that it was a part of a specific way to interact with patients, which contrasts with the psychoanalytic neutrality and the indifference, if not rudeness, expressed by some early behaviorists. Thus, while studying an original practice of medicine by post, I will also be able to explore the beginning and indigenization of behavioral therapy in the French context. So, firstly, what is medicine by post? Historians of medicine have demonstrated that consultation through the medium of letters has begun in the Middle Ages and were a fairly common practice in the 18th century. Letters at that time occurred mostly between an experienced and a junior physician in order to get advice, or between wealthy patients and well-known therapists to get a diagnosis and hopefully a treatment. For instance, in the second half of the 18th century, Swiss physician Samuel Auguste Tissot, who for the anecdote comes from Lausanne, received over 1,200 medical consultation letters from across Europe and beyond. Using those rich sources, scholars like Sonia Boone argue that the letters to Tissot not only express the struggle of individuals to understand the body and its working, but also reveal the close connection between body, disease, and politics. Then, in the beginning of the 20th century, another kind of medicine by post has been widely studied in the history of psychoanalysis. Here, the figure of Sigmund Freud played a central role, since he used letters to analyze himself, his first students, and even some of his patients. it seems obvious that psychoanalysts could be interested in private correspondence between individuals, since they have a particular interest in the role of relationships, and have proposed a rich conceptual apparatus to analyze it, notably the concept of transference. But what do we know about medicine by post outside of the very specific field of psychoanalysis? One might indeed wonder if this setting could even be applied to every form of psychotherapy, and especially to behavior therapy, which explicitly criticizes the psychoanalytical concept of transference. This paper aims to begin answering those questions with the example of Jacques Rognon, a French psychiatrist and behavior therapist, who often used letters in his psychotherapeutic setting. So, now, who was Jacques Rognon? As you may know, the French psychotherapy scene has been dominated by psychoanalysis. Therefore, the introduction of behavior therapy provoked an important reaction. This would go on to substantially and lastingly hinder the development of cognitive and behavior therapy compared to other European countries such as the UK, for example. Rognon played a significant role in the development of behavior therapy in the French context, since he was in the early 60s. Okay, thanks. Since he was in the early 60s, one of the first, if not the first, to practice it. He was a psychiatrist who trained at Santé Naval, the health services university of the French army. While Rognon was finishing his studies in Bordeaux, his supervisor, the professor of neuropsychiatry, Michel Berguignan, asked him to write a report of the new psychotherapeutic approaches which the psychologist Hans Eysenck was advocating for. 1 year later, Rognon and Berguignan published the first French article to focus on this subject, and then became one of the first presidents of the French Association of Behavior Therapy in the early 70s, and translated Joseph Wolpe's pioneer work into French. That's what you can see just here. If Rognon has been a true pioneer of behavior therapy in France, he was also an interpreter, since he decided to practice and to present behavior therapy in his own way. Indeed, he went as far as explicitly writing in his clinical articles that the therapeutic relationship often became a friendly relationship. And that he extended letters with his patients. Using letters in behavior therapy seems quite paradoxical. Indeed, why prefer a medium which promotes introspection when behaviorism is rooted on the critique of the very concept of consciousness? How behavior therapy is even feasible in such a context, and is it still behavior therapy? In order to answer those questions, I will now present a case study coming from Rognon's archives. It's a pretty strange story of an exhibitionist priest who desperately tried to drop out his bad habits. It's a quite surprising case, since exhibitionism was not the classical disorder associated with behavior therapy. Indeed, those therapies were more likely to be associated with phobia or anxiety disorder. I have chosen this specific case since Rognon published several papers on exhibitionism and became, against all odds, a French specialist of exhibitionism and its treatment. Moreover, this patient was the most prolific writer among the patients available in his archives, with more than 70 letters from him, from several physicians, and even from the priest supervisor. Having introduced Rognon, the main issue remains to be addressed. Why using letters in behavior therapy? I will thereafter endorse the claim that using letters was both a necessity and a choice. So, next one, please. Thank you. In September 1965, a physician from Angers wrote to Rognon. In the letter, he explained that he had just read his paper on exhibitionism and that he wanted to try this new technique with one of his patients. The case was a difficult one. The patient had already been convicted for indecent assault on a minor, and had been given a 6-month prison sentence. According to the physician, everything had been tried. The problem of the priest was described as conditioned by the ride of his small motorbike. More precisely, his disorder was associated with wandering across the countryside, almost like the famous mad travelers of Ian Akin. It seems that riding triggered his sexual urges. Thus, in their correspondence, there is often seemingly absurd discussion about how to avoid bicycle and motorbike. I will not describe in details the psychological treatment of the patients, just know that Rognon mostly used world-peace technique and in particular systematic desensitization. Since the patient lived more than 5 hours away from Rognon, the treatment occurred during 3 hospitalizations in Brest, each of them lasting several weeks. Here we can understand why letters were a necessity. For this patient and many others, probably, behavior therapy was a new and promising treatment, but was not directly accessible. Thus, between intensive sessions, letters were used by Rognon's patients, who often letters were used because it was a way to remotely follow the treatment. In the case of the priest, the available correspondence spread over no less than 6 years, and the content of the letters is a mix of personal news, psychological complaints, discussion about the psychological and pharmacological treatments. Unfortunately, we only have the letters to Rognon, but not the letters from Rognon. However, in his clinical writing, Rognon doesn't hide the fact that he exchanged letters with his patients. He even claimed that he developed some kind of friendship with them. Maybe just a few examples of the postcards. There is a main theme, there is always a church somewhere, and in always there is some churches, and also it's not very nice postcards. It seems to have a very strange taste for postcards, but anyway. Something which is particularly striking is the fact that behavior therapy is not often described as a form of psychotherapy which is interested in social bonding as a therapeutic ingredient. Quite the opposite. Pioneers and supporters of behavior therapy like Wolpe and Eysenck were critics of anything related with the Freudian concept of transference. Rognon was very well aware of that, since he himself translated into French an article of Eysenck where the latter wrote, I quote, that's Eysenck prose, psychoanalysis lays much stress on what is sometimes called transference, a devil conjured up only to be sent back to his usual habitat with much expenditure of time and energy. Behavior therapy has no need of this adjunct, nor does it admit that the evidence for its existence is remotely adequate at the present time. However, Rognon preferred a very more nuanced interpretation. That's a quote from one of his papers on exhibitionism. There are not any problems of emotional dependency at the end of the treatment. If a transference relationship has been established during the cure, and why would it not be possible in this kind of psychotherapy? Transference has never been the core phenomenon around which the treatment was organized. When the symptom has disappeared, the transference relationship naturally becomes a friendship. Sometimes a friendship. Something which brought me to keep in contact with most of my patients through letters during several years. Thus, exchanging letters with patients was not only a necessity, but also a choice. Even if Rognon agreed with the idea of a psychotherapy based on science, he also wanted to present it in a more palatable way for his colleagues. In a context where psychoanalysis was dominating the psych field in France, just remember that at that time the reign of Lacan was just beginning, it just could not blindly repeat Eysenck's positivist advocacy and promotion of behavior therapy. Quite the opposite. It tried to promote a third way between behaviorist objectivity and psychoanalytic neutrality. Another quote from Rognon: preserving an objective attitude does not prohibit the psychotherapist to establish a warm human contact intended to help the patients relax. A rigorous neutral stance, as it could be expected in some psychotherapies, could be frustrating and could disrupt the climate of mutual trust and relaxed collaboration, which are necessary for the good conduct of the treatment. So I am now going to the conclusion, and there are 3 points that I want to highlight. Firstly, medicine by post, like medicine by post for historians of medicine, psychotherapy by post seems to be a very promising topic for historians of psychotherapy. It is already well known that correspondence played a crucial role in psychoanalysis, but it's more surprising that such medium was also involved in other forms of psychotherapy, like especially behavior therapy. Indeed, behavior therapists are often described as cold, scientific, technical practitioners, not really interested in any form of relationship. Thus, using those new sources could help us to offer a fresh look on the field. Secondly, in Rognon's specific case, letters were clearly not only a necessity related to the fact that most of the patients live far away from him, but also a choice. As they have demonstrated, using letters and mentioning them in this publication was also a strategic decision. Rognon chose to use letters as a friendly way to communicate with patients and thus try to bypass the critics which denounced behavioral therapy as a non-humanistic practice. And thirdly and lastly, this choice illustrated how the first practitioners tried to acclimatize behavioral therapy to the French context. The dominance of psychoanalysis pushed them, or at least some of them, to adopt a less offensive discourse towards psychoanalysis compared to what happened in the UK with Eysenck or in the US with Wolpe. Thus, Rognon presented his own version of behavioral therapy as more scientific than psychoanalysis and more humanistic than classic behavioral therapy. Thank you.
Question time. Jelena Martinovic. Jelena is a visiting postdoctoral fellow at University College of London, and she talks about her team, Psychotherapy and Death, and she would like to write a book about this team, and please tell us. Yeah.
That's good. I think I just need to make some.
Okay.
Thanks to Renato, Mauro, Sonu and Marco for organizing this meeting, and I was pleased to meet also new scholars that I haven't known previously, and to see again other scholars, colleagues that I've known, and to meet students. Hopefully you'll have also some questions so that I can hear what kind of interests you might have in the history of psychology and psychotherapy. So I take this opportunity to articulate my current research project that has a preliminary title, Therapeutics of Death, Ars Moriendi in the 20th Century, to articulate this project with literature. So despite its vital significance in medicine and the humanities, there's been no study undertaken on the impact of death and dying studies on mental health discourses in the 20th century. And similarly, no detailed historical analysis exists on thanatology and psychoanalysis, although death has constituted a major part in the work of Freud, his followers or disputers. So in my work I argue that death and dying studies were put into sharp focus in psychological disciplines since the late 19th century, and especially after World War I, with studies conducted on survivors. So the studies conducted on survivors after World War I, as well as studies conducted with terminal ill patients, have led to the development of post-World War II oncology, but also pain management and palliative care. So in a way, I want to do a study that starts before the main achievements of biomedicine and post-World War medicine and care, and to look what are the antecedents of these established practices that we so much associate also with the psychologization of death, if you think of palliative care and the work of Elizabeth Kübler-Ross, about which we have been talking yesterday. And I also think that the psychological debates from the 19th century to today, and especially the way they dealt with ars moriendi, so philosophical debates, both or theological debates, both Western and Eastern, have been articulated by psychology in an important way, so that we conceive also certain concepts as granted, such as denial of death, taboo of death, etc. So it's also not only history of psychology, but also history of culture and how these aspects are connected. It's in a way a psychotherapy that looks outside of the clinic into what happens in the world and then brings it back to articulate clinical practice and find solutions when it's difficult, like how to address the question of a fatal diagnostic to a patient, or how to accompany somebody who's in grief, etc. So, next one. If you take the flash. No. Well, so to examine the relationship or the history of psychotherapy and death and its relationship to literature, I propose these key questions that I tried to articulate throughout the text in a rather explorative way than an in-depth study at this stage. But one question that I would have is like, how has literature been translated into psychotherapy? That means, how has it found a clinical application? And then the second question is, what is the epistemological value of empirical studies, so meaning accounts written in the first person, survivors, to address a problem in therapy? Could be palliative care, but it could be also something else, and more widely, society. So what you learn in a psychotherapeutic practice about grief or terminal illness could give something back to the society. So it's these two aspects, and I think literature is there a building bridge. And to reflect on these two questions, I propose to look at different places, cultures, and disciplines as the conference suggested. And to start, next one. Yeah, so I will, to start, I will look at, or I will evocate three different examples. So one is the psychiatrist Russell Noyes, and another one is Viktor Frankl, and the third one is Robert J. Lifton. So three different personalities that work in different fields of psychological disciplines, but that they are all situated in this post-World War II context of the rediscovery of death, which has been coined in the 1980s as a way to express what happened in biomedicine, the progress, but at the same time the development of palliative care and the increasing implication of psychologists in literary philosophical debates about the meaning of death, as this book edited by Hermann Feifel shows. Next one. And so in my work I argue that if you look at death and dying studies and psychotherapy, one can understand two things. First is how a clinical association begins to rise between trauma theory and personal growth. So survivor studies, for example, on near death, that are examined to understand psychological mechanisms. And then the second one is the concepts, both Western and Eastern, that are imported into psychotherapeutic practice and that inform practitioners and inform them also about the modes of conduit and a sort of a guidance. And in this history, in fact, it is important to look at the histoire croisée, so between the survivor studies and so those who have almost died but haven't died. This includes also attempts of suicide. And on the other hand, those who anticipate that they will die, terminal illness. And so even those who are very implicated in the psychotherapy and oncology, like Lawrence Lacan and Ada Lacan at that time, they also emphasize this fact that it's important to consider survivor studies and palliative care. But also that examining these issues would help them also to reflect on their own reluctance or fears. For example, of not wanting to accompany a patient who has a fatal diagnostic, or even as Kurt Eisler said in his seminal book, Psychiatrist and the Dying Patient, that there is an issue also in psychoanalytic treatment that when the patient becomes older and sick, that there is a tendency to want to abandon the patient because the consequences are quite high to kind of continue to engage in the psychotherapeutic relationship. So here you see that looking outside at survivor studies helps to think and rethink one's own practice and relationship to death if it's happening in one's own psychotherapeutic practice. But let me now move on to this one first example, which is a sheet that has been written in 1970 by a Midwestern psychiatrist who decided to study accounts of survivors because he wanted to understand how can I qualify phenomenologically the experience of dying and how can I bring this back to palliative care. And in order to do this research, he asked, now I have to see if I find the sheet. So he asked his father, who was at the time a professor of university at Indiana University, he asked him to distribute the sheets to his students in literary studies to find as many examples as possible to help him also to compile literary studies. So I'm just quoting here the sheet that was distributed, and it says, "My son Russell Noyes Jr. is engaged in the study of experience of dying as reported by persons who experience the threat of sudden death by drowning, travel accidents, heart attacks, and survived. To aid and enrich his inquiry, he is seeking first-person accounts of such experiences from fiction and from the works of authors giving personal accounts and reactions. Some examples are Poe's Descent into the Maelstrom, Ambrose Bierce's incident at Owl Creek Bridge, Jung's Visions, Dreams and Reflections, De Quincey's autobiography. If you know of accounts of this sort and will list authors and titles at the bottom of this sheet and place it in my mailbox, my son will be most grateful for your help in advancing our understanding through the literature of a crucial psychiatric response in human behavior." So he received between 10 and 15 sheets that listed different references, most importantly and repeatedly Hemingway, To Whom the Bell Tolls, Farewell to Arms, a fictional account of Hemingway's own war experience, to Emily Dickinson's I Heard a Bus Fly, or Melville's White Jacket. But besides looking into literature, Noyes also wanted especially to find first-person accounts, if possible written by psychologists, because he considered them as the ideal narrators. That's why he was looking into Jung's own experience of a near-death experience in 1944, but he was also looking at William James' conception of mystical consciousness as a way to articulate the empirical findings. The second sheet, you don't see anything, but the second sheet was sent to him by Alvin Rosenfeld, who is a scholar of literary studies and today still the director of the Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism at Indiana University. So his choice of literature to elucidate the problem of near-death and dying was Elie Wiesel's Night, so the autobiographical account of the author's experience in Auschwitz, Primo Levi's If This Be a Man, and Viktor Frankl's Logotherapy, and he wrote on the side, important in this regard. So it's just Alvin Rosenfeld, a Jewish studies scholars, who connects psychology. You see this connection of survivor studies, but written also by psychologists as Viktor Frankl, and this connecting point with literary studies. So if this collaboration with a literary scholar attests some sort of creativity, because maybe not everybody would ask his father to send suggestions for reading material, because he had limited time. He published in his life 350 articles and had a clinical practice, 30% of teaching, so you cannot read everything to kind of address the problem of death, but he nevertheless tried to make his best and ask his father. But so in a way it's innovative, but in another hand it's what I explained also yesterday, it's this context of the beginning of the 1970s where there is a waning influence of psychoanalysis in academic psychiatry, and a way to address problems of human nature and behavior would be to look into philosophy and literature rather than just through the angle of psychoanalysis. So this was a way for him to remain in an orthodox practice, but including insights from literature to still be able to talk about fundamental issues. So that's just to give an overview of how he connected the different themes. So when he talked about taboo of death or the art of dying, he would look back into medieval arts of Moriendi and etc. I don't have time to go into detail, but that's his form of medical humanities that he did. To remember, medical humanities was officially institutionalized only in the beginning of the 1970s in the United States. We can go to the next one. But he also acted as a translator of studies that have been considered by him and his colleague, Roy Cletty, who was a clinical psychologist, studies that were considered by them as foundational because they had empirical value. So one of the studies was Albert Heim, a geologist, Swiss geologist, who has written an empirical study on survivors in the Alps, so persons who fell from the mountain. His friends, actually from the Alpine Club, who told him what they experienced during the fractions of seconds when they were falling. He reported that there is a general tendency not to fear anything, not to have any pain. Also the faculty to go back in time, see images from one's past. And then Oskar Pfister's analysis of this particular self-report by Albert Heim in 1930 that he published in the Internationale Zeitschrift für Psychoanalyse. And so they translated both scholars, but also treating them as a sort of foundational corpus for psychiatrists of their time and thanatologists, so publishing both articles in interdisciplinary journals dedicated to thanatology, but approached from the point of view of psychology. And so it's the self-report mixed with Jung's self-report, but also literary considerations about the end of life that allow them to postulate a sort of a phenomenological description of what happens if somebody is suddenly in a situation of being confronted by the possibility to die, for example in an accident. And they described it as a evolvement from resistance to struggle and acceptance, which can include feelings of transcendence, and the struggle can include the panoramic review, so going back to childhood experiences, which has been analyzed in a psychoanalytic way by Oskar Pfister in the 1930s. But interestingly, these survivor studies then reflect the studies on terminal illness as conducted by Elizabeth Kübler-Ross, where you see the stages, psychological stages, some sort of their initiative of a potential for transformation and potentially personal growth, which was not articulated in these terms, but can be seen from this perspective. So, how much time do I have left?
10 minutes.
Aha, still have, okay. So I move now to the second example. So Viktor Frankl, who is well known for his work, and I'm guessing that everybody is familiar with his logotherapy and existentialist approach to psychotherapy, and especially for his book, My Search for Meaning. I want to switch to his case because it's a continuation of this first remark that I did about the epistemological value of surviving within psychotherapy. So Viktor Frankl, 4 months after his liberation in the spring of 1945 from Nazi camp Türkenheim, so he has also survived Theresienstadt and Auschwitz, where he lost his mother, wife, his brother and his sister-in-law, as well as all his scientific papers. At the time, returned to Vienna, where he became head of the Vienna Polyclinic of Neurology and worked alongside Otto Pötzl. So the common narrative goes that Frankl, when returning to Vienna, after he had lost everything that was dear to him, that at this moment, this approach of logotherapy died, which, was born. That's a good one. So logotherapy was born, and which literally means healing through meaning, logos and therapy. So according also to biographers, it's within camp life that Frankl was able to deepen, confirm and elaborate his ideas that would attract so much attention when he published Doctor and Soul, that was only completed in 1954, but he finished the manuscript just when he was liberated from the camp. But it's also this belief that camp life, in camp life he succeeded somehow in rising above the situation, above the suffering of that moment, because he observed things that happened as if they happened already in the past. This is the argument of Soger in 2016 about Frankl's life. But this brings us also immediately to a history of controversial reception also of the works of Holocaust survivors who become psychotherapists, as we can notice also with the other example of Bettelheim, for example. And so there's a lot of controversies of what kind of narratives of suffering and conversion or change are used by the psychotherapists to establish their own agenda of a psychotherapy. But in Frankl's case, at least, it's his experience of daily contemplation of death, as he argues, that allowed him to contemplate a series of philosophical and spiritual questions about life and to eventually overcome his fears and gain, most importantly, mental health stability. In fact, he served in the camp as a sort of mental health caretaker, where he had to avoid suicide among the prisoners who had to join the camp. But even this fact is apparently contrasted. I mean, there's lots of historiographical work to do also about this reception. But so he argued that in camp he knew savoir mourir is comprendre mourir. So he turned his experience of surviving into a psychology of the concentration camp and joined also other psychologists such as Emil Lutz with his Psychologie des Lebens im Konzentrationslager Theresienstadt, published in 1949, or as I said, Bruno Bettelheim's Individual and Mass Behavior in Extreme Situations in 1943. So his claim about will to meaning includes or promotes an existentialist dimension rather than a drive-driven theory, and so this allowed him also to receive a broader reception within post-World War II America that was focusing on positive and existentialist psychotherapies. I'll move on to the last example, in which survivor histories play an important role, not so much in therapy, but where they are seen as a building bridge between literature and the clinical care of ill patients, articulated with an approach of psychohistory. So and then we could look at Robert J. Lifton's work, so a psychohistorian who worked mostly in social psychological research on thought reform, but also on youth, on Japanese youth, and who's known for his work also on brainwashing. He was involved in a study in 1962 founded by the Department of Psychiatry at Yale University, where he went to Hiroshima in 1962 and interviewed 33 of the 90,000 survivors' records that were held at the Hiroshima Research Institute for Nuclear Medicine and Biology. So he interviewed them and proposed a phenomenology of death symbolism, what he calls, to suggest that what we can learn from the survivors of Hiroshima could be a way to articulate more generally, in more universal terms, human suffering or the dealing with grief. So he suggests these 4 types of death symbolism, and he did different writings on the subject. I've just picked Death and Life, published initially in 1967, and so in which he argues that there is, for example, the element of death imprint that is particular within Holocaust survivors, because they continue to live in a permanent fear, which concerns the radiation of after effects, but also continuous relationship to group fears of nuclear extermination. So he makes often the comparison between Hiroshima survivors and the survivors of concentration camps. And then the second element would be guilt, so various forms of guilt, parents who survive their children's, but also ambivalence with regards to timing, like why did I die now and not before or later? So also feelings of responsibility, not being able to care for somebody. And then the third element would be psychic numbing, which refers to a whole cluster of syndromes and symptoms such as disaster syndrome, affective anesthesia. He doesn't deal in depth with psychiatric literature of catastrophe, but he does reflect on these feelings of apathy and these affective reactions that have been described to emphasize a psychic numbing that is in fact a protective mechanism that allows the survivor to somehow survive the catastrophe, but which has an ongoing effect on his or her life afterwards. And then a reflection on nurture and contagion, so referring to collective fears and collective events such as plague and how people do cope with massive disasters. So it's just to give you a taste of the way he approaches the problem of surviving. But what he suggests then is that all of us who continue to live while people anywhere die are survivors. So his attempt is to conduct empirical studies, but to develop some sort of general laws of human behavior. And he claims then that, I quote, the hibakusha, so the hibakusha means literally an explosion-affected person rather than survivors, so he develops a specific category for that. The hibakusha could, in certain activities such as peace movement, assume the aura of a spiritual elite who have known death and then return to teach others the secret of mastering it. So this is Lifton in Death and Life. So he was involved also, he was much received in the peace movement, as he was also active in promoting the PTSD based on the accounts of the survivors or the returning soldiers from Vietnam. So there's this element also of social engagement in psychiatry that is at the same time also a strange twist, because it's an American who goes investigate survivors from the A-bomb in Hiroshima, looking at specific cultural aspects of Japanese culture, but then universalizing the problem of guilt, which may reflect also his own issues with guilt. We don't know, but it's a strange endeavor if you think about it. And what you can discover also in reading his psychohistory about grief, suffering, and dying and surviving is that he also refers to literary expressions such as Tolstoy's Death of Ivan Ilyich, who was in fact the most quoted novel in the 1960s and 70s to talk about problems of denial. So in Tolstoy's novel, published in 1886, Ivan Ilyich Ivan Ilyich is severely ill and about to die, but he ignores his fate, as does his family ignore the fate, so including himself. It's only until the protagonist finds Gerasim, his servant, that he is able to somehow accept death. And so Lifton claims, based on his psychohistory of survivors, that these insights, as other insights from Tolstoy, help us to think about more general issues in psychotherapy, in oncology. And that, he says then, that Gerasim, the servant in Tolstoy's novel, tries to establish a sense of immortality that he links to a theme in Akira Kurosawa's film Ikiru, To Live, the film in which a bureaucratic person, a man, knows he is about to die, but he overcomes the self-condemnation by dedicating his final activity to build a park for his children. And so Lifton here, via literature, examines or says that there is a need for immortality to leave a sort of a monument for the people who remain after you. Similar claim that Becker made in his Denial of Death, which can be contested. But here it's interesting that for him it's an issue of immortality, whereas for others at the same time in the 1970s, like existentialist therapists, when they looked at the death of Ivan Ilyich, they were rather discussing the problem of denial of death in the therapist, and how can you overcome this silence somehow that is not productive for a therapeutic relationship. So to conclude, because I have 30 seconds left, is that so Lifton and Frankl give us insight into how death and dying attitudes were translated into psychotherapeutic concepts. I haven't gone into depth about that it informed logotherapy, but they also give us insight into how individual suffering was claimed in the form of a collective suffering, but also how this collective suffering was claimed by psychotherapists who themselves became very important literary persons. I mean, Viktor Frankl's book had sold more than 10 million copies, was translated into 10 languages at the time of his death, and is used in centers across the world. But it also shows how not only psychotherapists but also culture deals transculturally with suffering. So for example, to just give the last example then I end, is that Bettelheim's text about his experience in concentration camp was promoted by Gordon Allport, who decided to include it in an issue of Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology, after a lot of other journals had refused it. So here, this account of a survivor from a concentration camp becomes a text, foundational text that President Eisenhower suggested that should be read by the stationed soldiers in Germany after World War II. So there's a strange connection of survivor studies and war and military. Well, I will just stop here and then... Thank you.
Mitrano. Mena is adjunct professor of Loyola University of Chicago. She studies critical theory, modernism, psychoanalysis. She will talk about faith and Lacan, and welcome with us, Mena.
Thank you, Renato. Of course, I join my colleagues in thanking Mauro Ponzi, who invited me to be part of this event, and of course Sonu, Renato, and Marco for putting the event together. And I'm delighted to see students. I hope to build a bridge across the student presence today. My paper is divided into 3 parts, 3 movements. First, I'd like to talk about post-structuralism and what I call the between. Then I will be talking about faith as a structure of address and as affect. And the final part is more properly about speaking and questioning speaking at the intersection of psychoanalysis and faith. Quote, for faith, slide 2 please, thank you. Quote, for faith, far from annihilating questions through the idiotic prolapses of a blunt certitude, as many people, and not the least among them, imagine, can open certain abysses that all the meditation of the world will not be able to even glimpse. You tell me I've discovered nothing. It's true. I have never claimed to have discovered anything. All the things I've taken up are things that I've cobbled together with a bit of this and a bit of that. My paper comprises 2 epigraphs. I asked them to accompany me in this beginning. One from Jean-Luc Marion about the theoretical potentiality of faith. The other, very powerful, from Jacques Lacan about his own experimentalism. Such an experimentalism was certainly well attuned to the arch of critical thought that in the humanities one calls post-structuralism. Post-structuralism, or from an Anglo-American perspective, theory, has brought to bear on literature and literary criticism, which is the field where I'm speaking from, borrowings from other disciplines, different disciplines, so a bit of this and a bit of that, with psychoanalysis and philosophy in the forefront. Religious faith does not seem to have been part of this capacious discourse, although this is just a first impression and a superficial one at that. Next slide, please. Key post-structuralist thinkers like Jacques Derrida or Jean-François Lyotard have engaged St. Augustine, especially Confessions, and through St. Augustine they have intercepted the discourse on faith. As for Jacques Lacan, in the seminar on the names of the Father, 63, he reminds his audience, quote, I have been reading St. Augustine since I was an adolescent, end of quote. But it was Jean-Luc Marion who, with his reading of Augustine, fully fleshed out the relevance of faith within the post-structuralist project. This project, to use the words of Jacques Derrida, could be briefly summed up as a project about truth. Truth in terms of something, quote, which cannot be denied, something that happens beyond any performativity and beyond any theory, end of quote. It is about advancing, therefore, this project is about advancing toward a pre-theoretical zone beyond the questioning mode of philosophy, where the focus is on a sort of anterior acquiescence, there is a yes set to a relation to another, other present, future, past, anyway, to something other. And this connects somehow to what Jelena was saying. I think your excursion into that and surviving has a lot to do with the post-structuralist project. So something other especially than what is present, what is more proper to the present participle being, what appears as present or presence. So this implies moving beyond, and this is a point that interests me as a literary scholar, moving beyond the idea of the human subject, an idea of the human subject that is based on what critical theorist Axel Honneth calls the struggle for recognition. Lacan inserts himself in this movement and becomes a leading figure. He specifies his own restructuring of the functions of subject and object, on the basis that, as he says, Hegel's dialectic is false, because it does not account properly for an opening of the subject toward the object, for a twofold gap between the subject and the object that has fallen away from him. It is interesting to me, could we go to the next slide, please? It is interesting to me that Lacan offers one of the most, the clearest, the most eloquent project in this document, Discourse to Catholics, where he expounds at the same time on the difference between psychoanalysis and philosophy, and on the divergence of psychoanalysis from religion. Psychoanalysis, in instituting desire as an object of inquiry, psychoanalysis moves further than the philosophers in considering a truth that is such even though it remains undeciphered. What are we to think of a desire with which consciousness no longer has anything to do except to know it to be as unknowable as the thing in itself, but which is nevertheless recognized to be the structure of the for itself? And then he moves to this question, which I think is key. Well, it's key for my paper. Doesn't Freud seem to you to be more applicable than our philosophical tradition as regards conducting oneself correctly in relation to this extremity of intimacy that is at the same time excluded externality? His audience on this occasion included many religious scholars, and phrases like extremity of intimacy and excluded internality must have resonated for the scholars with the classic account in Augustine of his intellectual journey toward faith. For Lacan, as for the author of Confessions, the self is unknown. It is a void without a core. It crushes me because I do not have access to it, says Augustine. Now, yet the affinity with Augustine, which is outlined in this speech, serves Lacan only to further emphasize the gap, the void with religion, what separates psychoanalysis and religion. The psychoanalyst is an auditor, and as an auditor, he listens to lies that are told, that are confessed, Lacan says to me. But, quote, one of the goals of the silence that constitutes the rule of my listening is precisely the silence, to silence love, end of quote. Psychoanalysis and religion must keep silent one about the other. Could we have the next, please? Divided, yet linked, divided, yet linked by a space between. A bit like the two groups of praising speakers in this rare fresco that you see on the slide now, symmetrical but split by gender. There is no relation, but there is. Next, please. Lacan tirelessly delimits the boundaries of psychoanalysis to prevent any confusion of tongues, especially with religion. He talks about In Triumph of Religion, a text published in 1974, which originally was an interview. He emphasizes the rigor of the analyst. And this rigor is defined also against religion. He offers a narrative of modernity in which psychoanalysis emerges as a phenomenon connected to a specific historical moment. The moment of science, the moment of what Walter Benjamin would define the time of technological reproducibility. With regard to this particular time, psychoanalysis and religion are in relation and in tension. That is, in a relation of tension. And the relation of tension is inevitable because while religion tries to cure everything, Lacan says they are very good at fixing everything, secreting meaning, psychoanalysis instead is a symptom, is the symptom. It holds on to what does not work. So, despite the conflict, however, despite the divide, what I call the between of these two discourses, despite the conflict and across the divide, they seem to combine, and here I come to turn in the paper, they seem to combine psychoanalysis and religion, seem to combine to amplify the centrality of speech to the human experience. And that's why I'm interested in this inquiry. Speech, speaking, the experience of speaking, what does it involve, what does it mean? This was a core concern, this is a core concern in Lacan's writing. But it is the same question concerns religion when we consider something that is at the core of religion, and that is faith as a structure of address, which we shall look at through Jean-Luc Marion. But before I somehow return to Marion, whom I already mentioned, I need to mention some contemporary theologians and how they emphasize the notion of faith as affect. My example, could we please have the next slide? My example will be, for the purpose of this occasion, Marco Manzini, who at a recent conference questioned the divide between faith and science, although this is a very common motif among, as I understand it, among contemporary theologians. Faith produces knowledge, but what kind of knowledge? Knowledge of what? Based on this interrogation, Manzini rejects any opposition between faith and method, observation, verifiability, credibility, and what interests me, takes up faith in a semiotic and hermeneutic network to arrive at what he calls the structure of the act of faith. First, God approaches me in the science of the visible world. Two, it is true that I have no evidence, yet I see truths that are meaningful to me because I recognize that God is talking to me with love. Three, following from the ascent, my intellect desires to know more and better the subject of faith or belief. Although Manzini acknowledges no debt to post-structuralism, his own description, his own analysis of faith actually closely recalls Jean-Luc Marion's description of the dialogical relation to God that I will share with you in a second. I'm interested, however, in Manzini insofar as he stresses, quote, affect is the organ of faith. So now Jean-Luc Marion. For Marion, faith is a face-to-face without mediation, without intermediaries. Sorry, not without mediation, without intermediaries. Closely entwined with the question of welcoming the word of another. In his reading of Confessions, Marion makes the most of the literary aesthetic choice of Augustine. St. Augustine is not talking about God, it's not a treatise, a theological treatise, it's not talking of God, it's not metaphysics, but it's speaking to God. It's an intimate address. The vocative case builds up an intimate address that is inseparable from a turn toward my turn toward an unknown addressee outside the boundaries of what I could predicate of the addressee. Next slide, please. So, as Marion writes, turning one's face to God so that he can come over me, claim me, and call me, starting from himself well beyond what I could say, predict, or predicate of him, starting from myself alone, end of quote. Now, both Manzini and Marion together, from that perspective, offer me a perspective from which faith is enmeshed in what Lacan calls the primordial question. Next slide, please. As he spelled it out in an early speech known as also the report, the Rome report, this question, his primordial question is the following: there is no speech without a reply, even if it is met only with silence, provided that it has an auditor. End of quote. So the functional speech in analysis echoes the functional speech in faith, while of course remaining other from it. Speech is the presupposition of a reply, even when there is only silence. Manzini emphasizes the mutuality in welcoming the word of another. The act is twofold, double, and thus supplements Marion's description. In Manzini's account, not only does God turn his face to me, but I turn my face. This completion is really key, because I find God to be infinitely worthy of trust. Only the emphasis on this twofold face-to-face, which highlights the lack of intermediaries, makes the discourse on faith resonate with the subject beyond philosophy that Lacan had spelled out in Discourse to Catholics. Building on post-structuralist energies, in particular Derrida's notion of the trace, which implies an unmastered and therefore unknown addressee. A trace is left, anyone, anything. A bottle can leave a trace, a person can leave a trace. The addressee is always unknown. Building on these energies, Marion shifts the emphasis from the unknown addressee to what he calls the encounter. Faith, therefore, as a structure of address, pertains, quote, to the word that brings about an encounter. I find interesting, for the purposes of this paper, what I find interesting is that Marion closely connects his analysis of the relational space of faith with the idea of hermeneutic recovery, healing. There is a reparative work which the linguistic utterance is made to bear, to carry. 5 minutes. Oh my goodness, I'm in trouble. I manage it. Whereby the encounter becomes simultaneous with the return of the word. Now, the wonderful thing about Augustine, if you haven't read it, the marvelous thing about this text is that faith, which is a symbol of resistances, is cast in terms of the destitution of language and the destitution of the father. Augustine is a public intellectual, very successful, a lover of language, and a professor of literature. Next slide, please. And rhetoric, and as such, he is the product of his own father, who wished for him to have a gifted tongue. His conversion comes somewhat anticlimactically in Book 9, where Augustine writes, quote, I notify the people in Milan that they must find another bundle of words for their students, end of quote. So conversion arrives with the reorientation of his affectus for language, with the suspension of the command to be, which is carried within language, and entangled, importantly, with the ravaging power of the gaze of the other. Augustine sings and speaks because he wants to please and be pleased, a fact which Lacan refers explicitly in his seminar on the names of the Father, where Augustine's reparation is referred to, where Augustine is explicitly referred to, and this only preludes to the notion of the enigmatic aspect of the question of speaking. Next, please. And the enigmatic aspect is put in this terms. What is there whose voice the subject assumes each time he speaks? Now, I like to deliver the third part because it's the one I care about most, perhaps. Could we go to, perhaps, next slide. Now, in the press conference held in Rome in 1974, which became the text of the Triumph of Religion, Lacan was provocatively asked by a journalist, religion already says in the beginning was the word. St. John said that you have added nothing, to which he responds with the epigraph you read, and he adds, quote, I'm in favor of John. Lacan adds, I'm in favor of John, and in the beginning was the word, but it is an enigmatic beginning. He adds, it is when the word is incarnated that things really start going badly. Man is no longer at all happy. He no longer resembles at all a little dog who wags his tail or a nice monkey who masturbates. He no longer resembles anything. He is ravaged by the word. This is a great moment in Lacan because the text, it's a moment of neighborliness where the biblical text, next please. Yes. No, I'm sorry. Could you go back? Could you go back? Yes, I'm sorry about messing up the slides. So in the biblical text, speech is already presented as enigmatic. There is a wonderful passage from Sirach which means do not praise anyone before he speaks, for this is the way people are tested. Humans give proof of themselves. They appear in language, just as the refuse appears when the seed is shaken. Speaking is the test of the human, that is to say, both proof of the human, but also human temptation, that is, trial, ordeal. The Greek word used for test, peirasmos, means both temptation and test. Both tenses apply. For example, God tests the faith of Abraham precisely in this double sense. When Lacan says ravaged by the word, it is because speaking is proof and temptation. For this enigma unfolds, interestingly, through the description of his own psychoanalytic practice. If we are lucky, the next one. Thank you. Yes. In Discourse to Catholics, still in the same document, we had already mentioned something about this practice from Discourse to Catholics, but in Triumph of Religion, he speaks again of his profession as a sordid profession. He sees that his clients go back again and again. The thing gives them pleasure. They rejoice, he writes. And here he introduces the notion of a slice of the word. Why would they come back if it weren't to treat themselves to a slice of the word each time? Speaking is, yes, being toyed with by symbols, so the imaginary trajectory, but it's also temptation. It's taking. The taking of that slide or this slide. The analytic scene is the confessing of this taking. What is there whose voice the subject assumes that he takes each time he speaks? This is my conclusion. Could we go to the next slide? In the seminar, this wonderful seminar on the names of the Father, Lacan explains, I have to skip his discussion of two passages from Exodus, which is a pity, but for questions of time I have to do it. But in this seminar, Lacan entwines the question of the taking to the role of the Father, to the function of the Father as function, in a way that is truly fascinating. In that seminar, however, he moves away from the Father in the mythological sense and opens a space for the Father as a plurality of names, a spacing for names. The plurality of names indicates that to have a name does not grant you that you are the one who speaks. Now, this enigma is also illustrated with two icons of the Father. The first, you see it on the slide, it's two Caravaggios. The first Caravaggio is 1603, now at Uffizi. Lacan describes it this way: for there is a boy whose head is pushed up against a small stone altar. The child is suffering and grimacing. Abraham's knife is raised above it. The angel is there. The presence of the one whose name is not pronounced, because the angel comes in the name of I am what I am, in the name of someone who has many names. So the question of the angel, Lacan stops at the question of what is an angel, but I think, can we have the next slide, please? I think the question is actually more appropriate for this version of Isaac's sacrifice by Caravaggio. It's more appropriate if one looks at this image now held in Princeton. At the center of this painting, we find what we might call a dialectical rendition of Abraham, the father of Isaac. Abraham debates with the angel, and the son appears as a witness at the margin of the debate. Isaac is naked, or almost naked. His shoulders are lit. He is almost an accessory. The face of the angel is lit too, and his gaze holds Abraham's gaze. Isaac is not afraid. He's waiting for them to make a decision. In the Princeton version, the son is a subject position, a formalist subject position. Anyone could be in that position, but that would not make him or her a son. Isaac here is a witness to the debate. It's a perfect painting in its winning theatricality, I think. The suspended action suggests that the father is always listening to others, to angels and to others. He is suspended on a speech act. Unlike this Abram, the father in the other canvas you've seen is a man under trial, following through, is blindly executing. The angel points to the animal as if to divert the father's violence. In the earlier canvas, there is no such wilderness where your father is the enemy. What is an angel? Is an appropriate question there, because we have an interlocution suspended in the dark here, suspended in the darkness, with the angel perhaps an inner phantasm, an inner interlocutor, as the other term. One sent in the name of another, a giver. Isaac was after all a gift, a miraculous gift. So what is an angel, what is another? This question in the two Caravaggios seems strictly linked to another question. When is faith faith? And both questions are hinged on the question of the father, grasped as a spacing of names, as the various names of a withdrawn addressee. I find this entanglement fascinating. Lacan will go back to it in Ethics of Psychoanalysis, where once the recognition of another is has been woven in the imaginary trajectory of the self, quote, and these are Lacan's words, God's power resides in the capacity to advance into emptiness, that is, into darkness. And he says, echoing St. Augustine's ordeal, and again the recognition of another reveals itself as an adventure, again echoing Augustine. This is also my 30-second conclusion I borrow. So the spacing created by the multiplicity of names in Lacan's text informs us that Lacan's speaking being, par l'être, is not only determined by a network of symbols, and thus speaking always implies a reply, but also that this reply is tied up with the question of the father as a function. The question of psychoanalysis, what is speaking, therefore, concerns the production of a kind of symbolic adoption. I'm borrowing from Massimo Recalcati in a commentary to Clint Eastwood's $1 Million Baby. Recalcati also suggests that it is an anterior affirmation, borrowing without quoting. Derrida calling it the yes to the father, an anterior acquiescence, Derrida would say, which has the power to, quote, quoting Recalcati, to love the other precisely because she is a lost cause, not despite the fact that she is a lost cause, but precisely because the other is vulnerable. So on the names of the father, the plurality of names is an interlocution in the darkness and the spacing of an anterior affirmation. And that's why I'm interested in this seminar. Thank you for your attention. I will stop here.
Now it's time for questions. Please, students, don't be shy. And there are questions.
I don't know if it was politically correct to quote Recalcati. Anyway, I thought I would, because can I add something to this before this paper, to a large extent, is the product of a course I taught at Loyola this past semester, and it's the product of an interlocution with people like you, the students. My students were in my course on human values in literature, which was subtitled Love from St. Augustine to Roland Barthes being an influential literary critic. And we read St. Augustine together, rather they put up with reading St. Augustine with me, and it was pretty challenging. So, and I showed a clip from $1 Million Baby, and they got my point. So, as opposed to being disoriented and destabilized.
Yeah, thank you for your rich elaboration of these themes. My question is about the relation of, in this case, psychoanalysis and theology, and within a broader context. I'm reminded that the theologian Paul Tillich, responding to Heidegger, just succinctly said at one point, well, look, by Sein, by being Heidegger really means God. So look, whatever he may, however he's framing his discourse, this is a theology by a simple, in a way, quite violent substitution. So it's a question, how much is, in a way, the elaboration that you're accurately tracing through Lacan simply an ersatz theology of placing psychoanalysis in the space which he sees as vacated by theology, but he has to occupy or take over. Hence, the necessity of a confrontation, such central figures such as Augustine.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. It's a great question. So thank you. A few things. I want my response by replying to the very last point is no. I want to keep them separate. I want to keep them in tension. I don't want one to replace the other. But of course, I'm in a particularly weak position to respond because as a literary scholar interested in both discourses, I'm finding my way. But I want to, the between for me is really important. But I'm fascinated by you heard correctly, perhaps if you heard an attempted replacement, what you heard is my fascination with their tension. And I'm also glad you mentioned Paul Tillich, because actually I came across Tillich. This goes back to 2011 when I was researching on Susan Sontag, who is a contemporary theorist of photography and also a theorist influential in literary studies. And she had close connections with Tillich, so and she herself taught history of religion. But the relation between psychoanalysis and theology, of course, as someone who reads Lacan's writing as writing, sometimes his speech sounds theological to me sometimes, and he says the erratic use of the word, and I stay away from that. But in this, what prompted me in this inquiry is, it's the course I taught, and it's also part, hopefully, of the larger project, the new book on post-critique. But actually, it was also an interest in beginning to demarcate, to understand the distance. I don't know whether Marion is my best source, but I like when this considering faith, not religion, not theology. I actually am not interested, if I had to say the ultimate point, in theology, but in faith as a structural address, as in this version of this intimate externality or external intimacy. I don't know if I'm hearing, your question. Well,
yes. I mean, I think that the distinctions were completely clear in your discourse. But it was my issue is more on the part of Lacan, in the sense of his his confrontation.
Yes, I can add something that maybe I caught one of the pieces that I caught had to do with post-structuralism and the notion of a trace. Okay, anyone, anything, any object, any person can leave a trace, and this trace always reaches an unknown addressee. From this point of view, anything, any addressee is God. Derrida writes. Now, I am catching Lacan within the net, the post-structuralist net, so to speak. So, Lacan is different from Derrida. He recognizes that not anything can be God, but he does not want to talk about God. And his relation to theology is just, they secrete, theologians secrete meaning. This is what I understand. They secrete meaning. Psychoanalysis, it's the other face, it's the opposite. It holds on to what does not work. So it tries to instate the relation between, it does not talk about faith, although in Triumph of Religion it keeps talking about true religion. But theology as a discipline and psychoanalysis as a discipline, it tries to keep them the opposite of the other. And I think he has an investment at that point, this is 1974, from 63 to 74, I think he has an investment in demarcating the boundaries of his own discourse, of his own discipline.
In your opinion, why Lacan there is also a secular Lacan?
There's also a
secular.
secular.
Secular Lacan. In my opinion, the religion in Lacan is very important, but in Italy there an opinion of a secular Lacan.
Oh yes. I can guess. I came to this discourse from within the US. I first encountered Lacan with my postgraduate colleagues at Rutgers University, and to us, he was just a thinker of modernity. For me, he remains a thinker of modernity, but what has changed since then is that I got interested in psychoanalysis as a discourse, as a historical phenomenon, as a key into the contradictions of modernity, the redefinition of modernity. Of course, but I have no contact with the Italian in the sense, for this presentation, it was lovely to read Antonio Di Ciaccia's edition of The Triumph of Religion. It's a marvel because Di Ciaccia is the only one who includes the images. The English edition doesn't have the images, which is a pity. Yes, to me, Lacan is completely secular. I can't say more, maybe. It's an American Lacan.
There are other questions, Marco?
No, it is somehow related to what we were saying about is Lacan secular or not, because I was wondering if we spoke about this, the fact that in 1953 Lacan tried to have a connection with the Catholics, and he tried to meet the Pope as well. And I was wondering, what's your opinion about this? Was Lacan actually only trying to have an alliance, or his idea that his psychoanalysis was somehow more nearer to religion than other kinds of psychoanalysis? For example, ego psychology was somehow real. Because the strange thing is that the important intention of ego psychologists was to become nearer to Catholics and to Christianity in general than the original psychoanalysis. So it's a strange story, so to say.
This is a good question. I don't have the authority to answer. I can offer my personal opinion based on my research so far. Yes, his psychoanalysis is close to Catholicism. Not only his psychoanalysis, I think, is close to Christianity and Catholicism.
Sincere in this.
There is, of course, the political Lacan that tries always to build alliances, etc. But there is in discourse to Catholics, for example, I was struck. I did not know about this until I was doing research for this contribution. In discourse to Catholics, I was struck by his tone, which is not performative at all, and where he actually gives the most stringent and clearest description of his practice. And the contribution in our psychoanalysis went beyond philosophy and was actually, and it allowed me to understand why Lacan is an intermediary between philosophy and then critical thought. But yes, there is something. And I think one of his brothers was, so So I have no authority to answer, but this is a wildly interesting question, especially if I may add, to go back to Renato's question, the secular Lacan, and to Sonu's question, although I will cast it metaphorically. I think that there is an interestingly substitutive relation in Italy between feminist theory and Lacanian theory. So to the point that they may be almost like two theologies, one substituting for the other. So the question of the secular, why there is no secular Lacan in Italy, may be approached.
There is not. In Italy, there is a secular Lacan, but I think there are a lot of Jesuits that are interested in psychoanalysis.
Yes,
by Lacan.
Yes,
using Lacan.
I think because of what Marco was suggesting, probably, but I don't have the authority to answer that question. The fact that I teach at a Jesuit institution, however, has nothing to do with that.
Okay.
I will have to think about all these things.
Okay. See you tomorrow. See you in the afternoon. At 2 p.m. o'clock. And okay. See you later. Welcome for the afternoon session of our meeting, and a lot of you well know Marco Innamorati. Marco is associate professor at University of Rome Tor Vergata. He teaches dynamic psychology, but he is an historian of psychoanalysis. And today his talk is about double in psychoanalysis, I think in literature psychoanalysis. So Marco, please.
Afterwards.
This is Psychology.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank first of all Mauro Ponzi, sine qua non, because we are all his guests here, and I want to thank of course Renato, who is our guest in psychology here. And yes, my talk will be about the theme of the double, both in literature and in psychoanalysis, its psychoanalytical interpretation. Even if the strange thing is that even if the theme of the double has been developed in many senses in literature, the interpretation within psychoanalysis have been very few. But there is a very classical book about the theme of the double, which is Rank's book, Der Doppelganger. And Rank's book starts from a very particular thing, which is a movie which was very famous at the time Rank wrote this book. And Rank used this movie as an example, as a paradigm for the story of the double, for the theme of the double. And so let's start with what Rank says about the students of Prague. I'm quoting: Baldwin, which is the protagonist of the film, is prevented from loving a woman by his own personified self, and just as his mirror image follows him to the meetings with his beloved, so does Lilushka follow the Count's daughter like a shadow. Both these doubles intrude between the main characters in order to separate them. I have to say, before this happens, Baldwin is a student who is very poor. He meets a strange person who tells him, I can make you rich, but you have to give me something I want in this room. And Baldwin says, okay, I don't have anything precious here, so you can take anything you want. And he takes his image from the mirror. So he has no mirror, he has no shadow, and he becomes rich, but he has this problem. We always find, I quote again, we always find a likeness which resembles the main character down to the smallest particulars. Rank means in all the stories about the double, such as name, voice, and clothing, a likeness which, as though stolen from the mirror, like Hoffman says, primarily appears to the main character as a reflection. Always, too, this double works at cross purposes with its prototype. The catastrophe occurs in the relationship with a woman, predominantly ending in suicide by way of the death intended by the innocent persecutor. In a number of instances, the situation is combined with a thoroughgoing persecutory delusion, or is even replaced by it, thus assuming the picture of a total paranoid system of delusion. So this is the schema of all the situations, of all the literary situations where the double appears according to Rank. There is a situation of meeting the double, a composition of the first character with the double, the apex of the drama, many times kind of delusion of the protagonist, and in the end, either the homicide or a form of suicide. According to Rank's interpretation, the struggle with the other signifies the conflict with the unconscious. There are many examples from Rank that, according to Rank, fit the standard schema, the standard pattern of the history of the double. The Deus Exis by Hoffman, Peter Schlemihl by Chamisso, the Shadow by Andersen, another poetical composition by Damon, which is called The Shadow, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Titan by Jean-Paul, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, Le Horla by Guy de Maupassant. A couple of these examples are not really fitting the standard schema of Rank, but this is not the main problem here. The fact that even Rank recognizes the fact that not every story about double fits this schema really, this schema. I'm quoting again from Rank. There are treatments of the motive that come close to an extreme, which has only a somewhat loose connection with our topic. Up to this point, it has been a question either of a physical double, which takes a more distantly related form in the comedies of mistaken identities, or of a likeness which has been detached from the ego and become an individual being, shadow, reflection, portrait. Now we come upon the representationally opposite form of expression of the same psychic constellation. The representation by one and the same person of two distinct beings separated by amnesia, but, and this is the strange thing, these cases of double consciousness have also been observed clinically and have been presented quite often in recent literary works, though they need not be an object of our further investigation. So, Ranks expressly says, there are others examples, and they don't fit my standard pattern, but they are not important, which is really a very strange thing. As you know, there is a book, not really a book, a short essay by Freud, which is really very famous, The Uncanny, in Italian, Il Perturbante, which takes its premises exactly from Rank and describes many phases of the uncanny as related to the theme of the double. But even here, you can understand that even Freud understand that not every literary example of the treatment or the treatment of double fits the schema. So this is somehow a problem. I want to point out the fact that the theme of the double is not only a literary theme, because we can find examples of something related to the double, firstly in clinical or quasi-clinical experience. Of course, there are the classical example of psychosis, of alternating personality, or the theme of autoscopy, for example, in near-death experiences, which is something related to Jelena's work, of course. In many near-death experiences, a person makes experience of his body outside his soul, so he can see his body from outside, so somehow there is a situation of double virtually. But there are also, for example, primitive defense mechanisms which are related with somehow an experience of double. For example, dissociation in the sense of Perry, not in the usual sense of dissociation. In the primitive defense mechanism of dissociation, according to Perry, you do something, and afterwards, when you think of what you've done, you say to others, I can't believe I did this, I was not myself. Meaning that you can consider the fact that someone else did, which was your double in a way. In projection, the other person is your double in a way, because what he thinks it's something related to your thought, not his thought. In projective identification, you do something to make the other become somehow your double, because not only you project, but you do something and he actually end with doing something which is related with what you attributed to him, which is a even more interesting form of doubleness from the other. But there are also everyday experiences of the double. One is very famous from Freud's writings. Somehow Freud, I don't know why, I don't think in the uncanny, but in one of his writings, Freud says that he had the impression of meeting another person entering his cabin in the train, and in the end he discovered that it is only his image reflected in the glass, which was very uncanny, Freud says, of course. In dreams, you have the experience of a double person. You have experience of yourself, and you see yourself from outside. In social network activity today, you can have multiple personalities. You can have another personality which acts in a way different from your own in this kind of activity. There are also developmental experiences related to the double. For example, in mother-child experiences, you all know about the idea of the schizoparanoid position of Melanie Klein at the beginning of the experience of a child. The child doesn't know there is only one mother. He fantasizes that there are one good mother and one bad mother. And so this is somehow related to the experience of the double. According to Winnicott, the newborn does not exist. There is only a double, a couple in which two persons are strictly related, and so on. There are also religious examples related to the idea of the double. The idea of the soul, according exactly to Otto Rank, was related somehow with the literary existence of the double. For example, the daimonion of Socrates is related to the existence of a double. Socrates told that he doesn't do anything by himself, but he had a personal daimonion who suggested things to him and who told him what to do. The guardian angel also is somehow related to the idea of the double. That's another idea from Otto Rank. The identity of Lucifer and Satan is related to the double because the same persons is two completely different entities, because Lucifer is the most beautiful angel of the paradise and he becomes Satan afterwards. But also there is the ancient Egyptians' alliance of a human with a cat, which is related to the experience of the double, because the cat was the double of the subject. So, and this is some to various kinds of experiences of the double. But in literature, there are so many examples and so many themes related to the double that I can say that, I want to say that the double becomes somehow an hyper-object in literature. Hyper-object in the meaning of Timothy Morton, I quote from him, I coin the term hyper-object to refer to things that are massively distributed in time and space relative to humans. So, there are classic themes about the double as a shadow, as a water or looking glass image, as autoscopy. For example, Goliathki in the double from Dostoevsky is related to this, of alternate personality, of course, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There are examples of magical similar other. The classic one is Jupiter, who becomes a double of Amphitryon in order to make love with Amphitryon's wife. Helen of Troy, according to one possible version of the myth, is not really in Troy. He is brought away to Egypt, and the Helen which is in Troy is an image, is a double, is not the real Helen. So, and then there are the image of the other as a double, as in the picture of Dorian Gray. There are situations of the other tried to the selves, like in The Master of Ballantrae by Stevenson. There are examples of physical identical men with opposite character who love the same women, like in Dickens' Tales of Two Cities. Somehow there are examples of the other as a part of the body, which could be related to a Kleinian interpretation. The most classic example is The Nose by Gogol, where the protagonist meets his nose, who becomes a person much higher in social ranking than himself. And another classical example, very known in Italy, is Il Visconte Dimezzato by Calvino, where half Visconte making a life, half the other half of the same Visconte making another life. There are examples where the protagonist of the story is not the real one, but he is the dream of another. There are examples in Giovanni Papini and in Las Ruinas Circulares by Borges, and also the example of the dream of the butterfly by Chuang Tzu is related to this. I dreamed to be a butterfly, says Chuang Tzu, and in the end, now I don't know if it was me to have a dream about a butterfly, or if I am a dream of a butterfly myself. There are examples of the self becoming other, like Gregorio Samsa in the Metamorphosis. There are examples of a double as artificial self, like in the Golem example of Meyring, like in Shelley's Frankenstein. There is an example I know about the fear of being an artificial self in Buontempelli Giovani Anima Candida, which is much prior to something like Blade Runner. It was written in 1927. The protagonists hear a story about the fact that somehow some people produced artificial people, and now she thinks that he could be such an artificial person. And so in the end he becomes delusional, because he can't think about the idea of being an artificial self. Of course, there are examples of the other as non-dead and so on. The idea of Mephistopheles is related to the double. There are less obvious themes. For example, I take from Freud this quotation, and finally there is the constant recurrence of the same thing, the repetition of the same feature or character traits or vicissitude at the same crimes, or even the same names through consecutive generation. So the eternal recurrent, the constant recurrence of the same thing from Nietzsche becomes, according to Freud, an example of the double. There are many variations of the classical pattern described by Rank. For example, self and other are separated and they don't meet each other anymore, in the case of Plato's Symposium, or in the case of Helen of Egypt by Euripides, and afterwards the opera by Richard Strauss. There are examples of a benevolent persecution from the other, and how much time? Oh my God. Okay, there are many classical variations. In 2 minutes I can tell you anything, but I want to recall the fact that there are two very strange examples of the doubles, which are Freud and Schnitzler and Nietzsche and Jung. Freud recognizes that Schnitzler was somehow his double in a very famous letter. In a letter, Freud writes to Schnitzler, he writes, "I have been struggling with the question of why I have never in all these years made any effort to meet you and talk with you, not considering at that point whether you, on your part, would have wanted such acquaintance. The answer to this question contains what appears to me as too intimate a confession. I think I have avoided you out of a kind of a fear of finding my own double, Doppelgängerscheu." The same thing is about Nietzsche and Jung. Jung says that his double is can be called Zarathustra, and that Zarathustra is somehow the double of Nietzsche. So in the end, we can quote Allen Ginsberg, "My mind's got a mind of its own." Well, the simple thesis I can tell you about the possible interpretation of the double, which has not been written by psychoanalysts, is the double is a literary expression of dissociation rather than of conflict. And so this could be somehow related to the recent possibility of going back to Janet and Jung. This is somehow something that Mitchell and Bromberg say. I can quote from Mitchell, There are currents within contemporary psychoanalytic thought that portray the self as inaccessible, fluid, or discontinuous. Winnicott's incommunicado private self, Lacan's register of the real beneath the evanescent shifting of the imaginary, Ogden's the centered subjects oscillating within dialectics between conscious and unconscious, paranoid, schizoid, and depressive positions, and Hoffman's perpetually constructed and co-constructed experience. The same thing is from Bromberg, and is of course the most known in this faculty, I think. If one wished to read the contemporary psychoanalytic literature as a serialized Gothic romance, I like very much this quotation in this context, it is not hard to envision the restless god of Pierre Janet, banished from the castle by Sigmund Freud a century ago, returning for an overdue haunting of Freud's current descendants. With uncanny commonality, most major schools of analytic thought have become appropriately more responsive to the phenomenon of dissociation, and each in its own way is attempting actively to accommodate it within its model of the mind and its approach to clinical process. I jump this and I go to the last idea for this simple proposition. Could the theme of double be a new foundational myth for the psychology? Because the classical foundational myth is the myth of Oedipus. But the myth of the double, which was one very not very much studied literary theme from psychoanalysts, could become a new foundational myth, because a new psychoanalytic culture also needs new foundational myths. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, time for questions. Student? Okay. Students are shy.
You can put question in Italians if you
were there. Jelena.
Yes, that was great. I was wondering about you said new foundational myth, so new and foundational. So where would you start the foundational myth? Uncanny or rank or?
Well, the idea of the uncanny is related to Freud's idea. What I was thinking is the fact that, in a way, if one wants to come back to Janet and Jung, the relationship with the unconscious in a psychoanalytical environment should not be related to what you have to avoid. The main thing is not wo es war soll ich werden, but which means where there was S must become I, must become ego. But somehow related to the fact that, well, there is another self, I need to know this self, I need to confront this other self, I need to meet my anima, I need to meet my shadow, and they can't be as one. I can be many people somewhere, and this could be a simple way of putting the question, having such a foundational myth. In the idea of Oedipus, the fact is that either you repress the theme, or you risk to become blind. So knowing somehow can be a risk. And the idea is here that knowing should not be like that is a little naive, but of course you all know Jung psychology.
Again, following on from this question, would you suggest then that, seen from the standpoint of literary history, the whole era of dynamic psychology, depth psychology, is in a way a sub-genre within the overriding genre of the theme of the double? In that sense, the various analytic theories, you could say like a series of novella, a development within the overall framework of the motif of the double.
Yes.
So I'm exploring in the way that
this is
what you mean by myth in this sense. Are you then folding it back into literature, saying that what is proposed as theory is simply actually an elaboration of a literary structure?
Well, somehow I can relate for the 100th times to your general idea of the relationship between psychotherapies and foundational philosophy. Somehow, my fundamental idea is on one side that every psychodynamic culture needs its own myth. On the other, that every dynamic area is its own narration in a way. And also it could be related to the idea of psychological types related to the various kinds of psychotherapies as well. But also there is another thing that I wanted to say, that is that in Freudian culture, the idea of the foundational myth of Oedipus has been very deeply related to the success of Freudian psychoanalysis. Everyone knows about the story of Oedipus, no? And the force, the suggestive force of the myth of Oedipus has been overwhelming. So maybe the fact that other psychoanalytic culture have not had the same success is also related to the fact that they couldn't count on foundational myth of the same force as the Freudian original one. And my simple idea is that if Bromberg, Bromberg is alive, he's still alive, yeah. Mitchell is not. Bromberg and his friends could use somehow foundational myths like the double, could somehow suggest ideas which can be somehow elaborated from the general public as well. Yeah.
In your opinion, why today the dissociation is fashionable in the society of performance, in the society of a smart and an active person, a person as agency? So, do you think that the research for integrate dissociation is a sort of defense against the real mind of the person, that the person are dissociated, the person are not conscious as the society wants, and we know that this was an ancient theme of history of French psychology, for example.
Yeah, maybe I can answer with something I I prepared in advance, related to the fact that somehow the theme of the double today is even more strong than in the 19th century, because I was speaking about things that were written before Freud and before Jung. But if you consider the cinema culture of today, everything is double. For example, double personality. Movies like Dark Mirror, Despair by Fassbinder, Cet obscur objet du désir by Buñuel, Raising Cain by De Palma. The case of people living parallel lives, The Great Dictator, Vertigo, Doppelganger, of course, the title of the movie is related. La Double Vie de Véronique by Kieslowski. There are, of course, situations of multiple doubles. Of course, the case of Kubrick is almost particular, because Kubrick simply used the uncanny as a manual for making horror movies. So, Shining was written with the uncanny on the table, but there are many other movies like Black Swan by Aronofsky, for example. There are examples of double in the sense that two people become one, or one person become two people, like in Dead Ringers by Cronenberg, or Lost Highway by Lynch, or The Criminal Element by von Trier, or Fight Club by Pincher. There are examples of exchange of person, like The Whole Town's Talking by Ford, related to the Italian movie Fracchia la belva umana, for example. Yeah, it's the theme of the dog. I don't translate for strangers, because they don't really want to know. And of course there is the theme of the virtual, of the artificial double. The most classic is the invasion of the body snatchers, and so on. Example of the relationship between the spiritual with the physical double. But also there are examples of the fact that a forgotten self can be somehow a double. If you remember the movie Memento, what the protagonist of Memento did and don't remember is something somehow made by another person. And the same happened for the protagonist of Ascenseur pour les chevaux by Rémy, whose soundtrack was made by Miles Davis. This is just for Sonu, of course, quoting jazz here. Okay, that's.
But you think that?
I think so. Yeah.
No, all the movie are a sort of exorcism or a sort of a reaction cure for the human nature.
Absolutely. That's my provisional opinion.
Okay. No, another question.
I want to ask you, if you know
He is
him,
a student of philosophy.
and as a psychologist, if you know him, what do you think about the work of Georges Lapassade, since he's an author who worked for a long time about the theme of dissociation, of the normality of dissociation in general? What do you think about the work of Georges Lapassade in relation to these themes?
Well, I think that there are so many works about the double, or I have to confess that I haven't read Lapassade, simply, unfortunately. But there are so many examples of things about the double. For example, I found that there is a book about the double in the modern, in the contemporary horror movie in Japan. A book just about this. There is a book about the theme of the double in Chinese literature. So I think that the theme is something impossible to cover, to completely cover. This is just some provisional remarks, no more than this.
Another question?
Andrea voleva forse chiedere.
I would like to thank Roberto and Marco for the organization, all the speakers, and the audience, of course. Unfortunately, I have a problem with my voice. I am not be able to read my paper, but I have a double.
I'm honored.
Thank you, Mena Mitrano. She read my paper now.
The men have always a woman as double.
Body images, reproducibility, and perception of works of art in Walter Benjamin's communication theory. And the first section is entitled The Author as Producer. At the time of the First World War, Hermann Hesse discovered psychoanalysis, so to speak, calling it an awakening. Suffering severe depression because of family problems, he was admitted to the Sarmat clinic near Lausanne for nervous and mental diseases, where he was subjected to psychoanalytic therapy in 12 sessions with Dr. J.B. Lang, a follower of Carl Gustav Jung. The therapy continued even after the writer was discharged from the clinic for a total of 60 sessions from June 1916 to November 1917. Discovering psychoanalysis was not only a way for Hesse to regain his psychic balance and believe in his own expressive means, but was a real revelation that disclosed a new worldview, providing him with a new key to structuring his works. Indeed, after 1919, his writing had reached a turning point. Hesse was able to write characters and situations that gave his novels both the introspective character of psychoanalysis and a liberating and self-affirming alternative stance. The author himself reveals how he used the just discovered worldview in a 1918 essay called Artists and Psychoanalysis, in which he treats the problem of the unconscious as a compositional criterion for art and therefore for his narrative. Quote, how fruitful that new theory was immediately resulted both by applying it to poetic works and by using it to observe everyday life. But the same confirmations and corrections had Nietzsche's psychological discoveries and the insights which were, for us, of extreme value, end of quote. Hesse highlights the exchange of languages, figures, myths between literature and psychoanalysis. According to Hesse, literature, in fact, told stories of neurosis through images and stylistic elements, trying to define those neuroses and sometimes explain them through myths and fanciful figures even before the birth of psychoanalysis. Freud himself, meanwhile, drew on literature to define syndromes and psychic phenomena. Much of the literature of fin de siècle Jena treated psychic phenomena and syndromes so much so as to be called Nervenkunst, the art of neurosis. Psychoanalysts, for their part, often engaged in the interpretation of works of art on the basis of psychoanalytic theories, making works or characters the paradigmatic example of a syndrome. Walter Benjamin, in his 1935 essay, The Work of Art, in the age of its technological reproducibility, tries to analyze the new way of producing and perceiving art communications in modernity. Benjamin wrote 5 different versions of this essay, the artwork essay, as well as many minor papers on the subject. The version that will be the focus of the analysis here on Benjamin's writings on art is the 3rd version, 1936, according to the New German Critical Complete Edition, which was the basis for the French edition, the only one published during Benjamin's lifetime. These 2 versions, the 3rd and the 4th, are the core of this constellation of writings, which must be related to the revisions of the 1939 version and later notes and minor works as a counterpoint. This latter had a tense relationship to the core of Benjamin's writings on the work of art. They complement, correct, and sometimes contradict him. Just as the central nucleus is the result of a path, the stages of which can be clearly identified in the Doctrine of the Similar, 1933, and the author as producer, 1934, in which an intertextuality with the artwork essay can easily be detected. The tension-charged relationship and the reappearance of passages in the form of self-quotation or montage of pre-existing texts are 2 aspects of Baltham Benjamin's methodology. The work of art has always been reproducible, but there was always a substantial difference, especially in reception, between the original and the copy. With the birth of photography and cinema, we witness a real technical reproducibility of the work of art determines the deterioration of the aura. This phenomenon is linked to the different perception of art by the masses, the desire of the present-day masses to get closer to things, and to the technical reproducibility that mangles what is unique. On the one hand, therefore, we are faced with a historical, technical, and objective phenomenon. With film and photography, it no longer makes sense to speak of original and copy, and we certainly can't look for the aura of a picture in the negative or that of a movie in the undeveloped film. On the other hand, however, the way of perceiving all works of art, even in traditional media, has changed precisely because of their technical reproducibility, which makes them another object, another commodity with a fetishistic character caused by the reproduction. Both phenomena, the masses as receptors and the technical reproducibility of the work of art, are closely linked in the modern age and determined a new way of perceiving art and the need to develop new artistic languages. When the criterion of authenticity in artistic production is lost, the entire social function of art changes radically. Its ritual function, its foundation, must be replaced with another practice, that is, its foundation in politics. Benjamin distinguishes between the artwork's cult value and its exhibition value. The first is functional to an erratic, mythical, magical, and ritual conception of art. The second is determined by reproducibility and has enormously increased the exhibition of the work of art. The first culminates in human sacrifice, while the result of the second is that human beings began to distance themselves from nature, and it finds its essence in the theater. To emphasize the relationship with this equipment, Benjamin cites Pirandello's novel Quaderni di Serafino Gubbio, Operatore, Notebooks of Serafino Gubbio, Cameraman, 1925, initially published in 1916 under the title Si gira, shoot, which Benjamin probably read in the French edition entitled On Tourne. Serafino Gubbio is a machine man. He identifies himself with the machine, but he sees its negative and dehumanizing effects. Benjamin reverses Pirandello's interpretation and uses it to accentuate the relationship with equipment as an example of liberation from the cultic approach. Pirandello seems to protest ironically against the diffusion of machines, against the fact that they progressively replace the work of man. Indeed, he seems to go in the opposite direction to Aragon in Les Paysans de Paris, so often quoted by Benjamin in his Arcade project. Benjamin is fascinated, however, by the fact that Pirandello's novel is set in the film production process on the set, and that it is as melancholic a reflection as one could want on technical reproducibility and its consequences for the production of works of art. There is no aura while shooting, but only the actor's performance in front of the camera. The aura only arises when the art product is perceived by the public. A theatre actor performs before the public. His acting as the characteristic of uniqueness. The film actor performs in front of a machine. He can repeat the scene over and over again, and his performance is cut and edited. In reversing Pirandello's veiled aversion to machines, Benjamin uses Brechtian arguments. In his theory, we hear the echo of the estrangement effect, Verfremdungseffekt, although it should be noted that Brecht's theory of cinema is somewhat different and perhaps more complicated and problematic. Section 2. In the past, a small number of writers produced work for a large number of readers. With the development of the press, newspapers and magazines, many readers became writers. The distinction between author and reader is in the process of disappearing, and what has been happening in literature is also currently occurring with photography and film. On social networks, everyone reproduces his or her own image and films himself or herself. Benjamin's paradoxical statement that everyone has the right to be filmed does not seem to correspond to a liberating or revolutionary process. It seems rather a process dictated by wild narcissism. It is another nature that speaks to the camera compared to the eye. The camera's gaze is based on play, on the transfiguration of reality, on its transformation into a metaphor, on its transcription into an artistic language. Instead of creative space informed by human consciousness, there is a space informed by the unconscious. Art has escaped the realm of beautiful semblance. Quote, in my nieces tightly interfolded like cotyledons slumber the two aspects of art, semblance and play. End of quote. Semblance is the most refined and therefore most resistant scheme of all the magical procedures of the first aspect, while play is the inexhaustible reserve of all the experimental procedures of the second. In the short text, The Doctrine of the Similar, Benjamin speaks of the mimetic faculty expressed in a child's play when the child imitates the actions of the adults or life experiences. Within this constellation of writings and in the preparatory materials for the Arcade project in an even more explicit way, play and the mimetic faculty must be related to Freud's doctrine. Benjamin writes that the perceptual world of modern human beings seems to contain far fewer magical correspondences than did that of primitive peoples. Freud speaks of the psyche of modern man who repeats the passages of the prehistoric primitive man. Benjamin asserts that we must speak of a complete transformation of the mimetic faculty. The canon through which one can shed light on the mimetic faculty is language. And language expresses, consciously or unconsciously, the impulses and also the traumas of the speaker in a series of symbols, icons, or images that seem incomprehensible. Writing, script has become, together with language, an archive of non-sensitive similarities and correspondences. When Benjamin talks of playing, he seems to be alluding to both the wordplay of the Dadaists and infantile play more generally. But the child's play and its mimetic faculty that hides the unconscious, which is often a projection of a sorrow or trauma, must be interpreted in light of Freud's writings. In fact, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud explains the mechanisms for the defense of the psyche. Indeed, he writes of the cortical cortex for external stimuli, that is, the shock caused by the radical transformation of modernity, to use Benjamin's terminology. He speaks, however, of distortion, Entstellung, that is, of that phenomenon whereby the mind tends to apply the same defense mechanisms against external stimuli that it usually uses against internal stimuli coming from the depths, causing a relocation, and uses a child's play as an example. The child who throws away the toys and expects someone to bring them back to him just wants to imitate. He therefore uses the mimetic faculty to experience the displeasure of detachment from his mother and the pleasure of seeing her again. The mechanism of perception of the work of art through the second technique is explained by Benjamin through his play in the Freudian model. It is therefore not their life and not even the individual's experience that are represented in the work of art and in a child's play, let alone the romantic dream, but rather the distortion of an instinct. Indeed, Siegfried Weigel speaks of distorted similitudes. The mimetic attitude of the past clairvoyance has progressively moved into language and writing, which has provided us with the most complete archive of non-sensitive similarity. The production of images has its origin in psychoanalysis. It is the way in which the unconscious tries to communicate, or rather express, the instinct through metaphor, a representation through symbolic images in the dream. It creates an oniric space, Traumraum, on which artistic communication and communication in general draws heavily. The image space built around is a bodily space, Leibraum, writes Benjamin in his essay on surrealism. It speaks of materialistic anthropology and conceives of the psyche as a physische Kreatur, of man's interiority. That is, he explicitly refers to the Freudian body ego, to the fact that the stimuli emerge in the corporeality of man, in his mind, in the cortical cortex as per Freud. The thought images, Denkbilder, through which modern communication happens, have a body aspect and are produced by the individual's physicality. The innovation that Benjamin treats both in the essay One-Way Street and in his essay on the work of art is not a social form of life, but rather the corporeality of psychic processes that produce images and concepts and make the images themselves, as well as neuroses, objects, materially concrete things. In short, Benjamin wants to exclude any mythical interpretation of the dream, and the production of images that can be traced back to a romantic or Neoplatonic approach, and repeatedly stresses, perhaps to an excess, the political value of his approach. Aristotle in The Anima speaks of mnemonic images with the function of activating memory. Freud overturns this Aristotelian principle. The images nested and stored in the unconscious acquire a symbolic function emerging from the unconscious memory as indecipherable. The illegibility of dreams, the need to decipher them, to go beyond the system of science, depends on the fact that they use a language partly linked to the individual's experiences and stimuli, partly to the collective reservoir of images that the dream collect. This dual origin makes the language of the unconscious increasingly enigmatic. Writing a dream story means, as Benjamin aims to do in the Arcade project, writing a grammar of dream images. In this sense, there is a parallelism between the procedure of the procedures, in the plural, of Benjamin and Freud. Both want to decipher the symbolic language of dreams, Freud for a therapeutic purpose, and Benjamin to understand the mechanisms of language in artistic, cultural communication and general communication in the modern era. This conception of the bodily ego as an object, as a material, as a thing, and the consequent material consideration of dream images and images of artistic communication, which involves highlighting the awakening or the moment in which we ask ourselves the origin of these images, which partly coincides with psychoanalytic therapy, partly with literary analysis to decipher dream language, are the basis, all of this, are the basis of the will expressed by Benjamin in the Arcade Project to write the history of dreams, or the history of the collective imagination. This dislocation from the dream world to the moment of awakening and the analysis of linguistic codes is defined by Benjamin as the Copernican revolution. In a text from 1922-23, Schemata zum psychophysische Problem, Benjamin insists on the bodily function of the differentiation of impulses coming from psychic excitement, evidently with reference to Freud. Memory inscribed into the body of the subject, both the producer and the recipient, as permanent traces, quote, which structure in response to certain perceptions, the repetition of affects and mental images associated with them, whereby this repetition is never the repetition of the same, but always another return, the return of the other, end of quote. The need to decipher allegories or metaphors or symbols, which are essentially the Denkbilder, risks undermining the legibility that betrays or could betray the author's intention or the function of repression, projection, or sublimation. It is true that the author inserts into the artistic text the key to deciphering his writing strategy. Then, insofar as he uses the reservoir of images coming from imaginative space and from the social communication space, symbolic representation of his own instincts, the text acquires a polysemy that goes far beyond the author's experience and his artistic intentions. Benjamin has developed this theory of readability in relation to bodily memory. Benjamin's theory of the dialectical image stresses the practice of reading, quote, as it is only reading that constitutes the has-been, das Gewesene, in the first place, by producing it as an image. Here, the concern is no longer a memory of images, still Benjamin, no longer the memory of images, nor a practice of recollection in, sorry, it's Weigel, right, I'm sorry. Memory of images, nor a practice of recollection in relation to and with the aid of images. Rather, the structure of recollection itself is transposed into an image space built round as an imagistic character, end of quote. Benjamin speaks of metaphorization, of explosive material, of the development of photography. What is decipherable in this process is not so much the knowledge of the past, but rather the residue of, quote, a dream world, the desire symbol in an age of scattered ruins. The last section. The actor is not at ease, the friend in front of the apparatur described by Pirandello. It displaces the man in front of his own image in the mirror, because this image is separable from him, becomes transposable, is transported in front of the masses. Even the politician is exposed to the masses through radio and cinema. Benjamin sensed the changed relationship between citizens and power due to the new media as early as 1924 in Naples, when he listened to Mussolini's speeches on the radio and had the opportunity to observe the political use of cinema and newsreel by Hitler after 1933. Quote, it's Benjamin, radio and film are changing not only the function of the professional actor, but equally the function of those who, like the politician, present themselves before this media. The direction of this change is the same for the film actor and the politician, regardless of their different tasks, unquote. This means that in art as in politics, not only was there a radical transformation of the production of artistic and political language due to new techniques and the transportability of image reproduction that made the political discourse and the actors acting a performance, a test in front of the masses. But there was also that, for that very reason, there was a new way to perceive art and politics. This produced a new selection, a selection in front of the equipment, the result of which is the champion, the star, and the dictator. This transportability, therefore, makes the new mode of reception prominent, so that artists and politicians become wisecracking persons through the new ways in which the argument is mediated by communicative performance that can let emerge the first technique with its mythical and its cultural value. It is clear that when Benjamin speaks of dictators, he means Hitler and Stalin, but his considerations concern the technical reproducibility that was radically changed in communication. He realized that the forms of representation of bourgeois democracy were about to be emptied of meaning in favor of populist political communication, all based on the expository capacity of the performance of the leader, in German, Führer. Benjamin's considerations are valid for the following period. Today, the political arguments no longer carry weight. The communicative capacity of the political figure, his performative or her performative capacity before the media, where the joke, the hyperbole, the promise, the easy slogan, the ability to become directly an opinion maker is worth much more than any real data. In fact, through the capital of the film production companies, the revolutionary potentialities of this control are given a counter-revolutionary function. The cult of the star expresses the splendor of its commodity character, and the cult of the public, which fascism sought to substitute for class consciousness, favors the corrupt nature of the mass. Proletarian class consciousness transforms the structure of the proletarian mass into the representation of its oppressors. At the moment when the proletariat takes up its struggle for liberation, its mass is already dissolved. It makes the transition to action. Solidarity abolishes the undialectical opposition between individual and mass. The great achievement of a revolutionary leader lies not in drawing the masses after him, but in constantly incorporating himself into the masses. This palingenetic character of the second technique, when used by the proletariat, corresponds to the Marxist mood of the Revolutionary Writers' Conference, but it is strongly changed with utopianism. Thanks to the cinematographic technique, we experience for the first time the optical unconscious, as thanks to psychoanalysis we experience the unconscious drive. Indeed, the closest connections exist between these two forms of unconscious. The many aspects that the apparatus, i.e. the camera, can tear away from reality, i.e. zoom, slow motion, etc., are in fact located outside the normal spectrum of sensory perception. Many of the deformations and stereotypes, metamorphoses and catastrophes that can invest in film the optical world afflict the actual world in psychosis, hallucinations, and or dreams. In other words, the images that populate the dream world come from the imaginative space of cinema and vice versa. The image space, built realm of communication, is a collective space in which everyone participates. The oniric space is individual, but is populated by images that come from the collective space. This collective dream is identified by Benjamin in the character of the globe encircling Mickey Mouse. Collective laughter represents the anticipated and healthy outbreak of mass psychosis. American grotesque films and Disney films cause a therapeutic unconscious explosion. The comic and the scary are closely joined. In Disney's films, we can see the tendency to represent bestiality and oppression as phenomena that accompany existence. Benjamin expresses a severe political judgment on the consolatory character of American films, Disney films, and the grotesque. It is obvious that Hollywood Hollywood cinema tends to confirm the establishment and the American way of life precisely with its therapeutic function and with the techniques of sublimation and repression that play on the collective unconscious. This therapeutic substitute function was even exhibited by the studios that called themselves dream factories. Indeed, in the 1930s, the film industry theorized this therapeutic function, which psychoanalysts would call sublimation, linked to the leisure industry. In the face of the objection that in reality millionaires do not marry secretaries, film producers replied that the secretaries and employees in general do not want to spend their free time watching films of the sad story of the secretaries. They wanted to dream. Hollywood cinema therefore represented desire and constituted the best example of the interchange between image space and oniric space. However, it is also the best example of the very introduction of the first technique, of the production of illusion of appearance, of the mythical, magical dimension. It's the last move, the last page. Benjamin clearly distinguishes between Chaplin and Disney in the use of the grotesque, identifying in the first the use of the second technique, while Disney would be the paradigmatic example of the use of the first technique, of the return of the mythical magic and the therapeutic value of cinema, allowing people to accept reality as it is, with its deleterious aspects, and escape into the dream, into the impossible desire. At least in some passages, however, Benjamin's political judgment emerges against the grotesque tout court. The ironic grotesque approach can be useful to bring out an awareness, to acquire that unhappy consciousness of which Hegel speaks, but then the reversal of theory to practice is necessary. In his essay on the work of art in the age of technological reproducibility, Benjamin shows he well understood the relationship between the cinema and the collective imagination in all its components, liberating and revolutionary, but leading back to the star system and the return of the mythical magic of the first technique. The most important aspect of his analysis of visual art is the discovery of this close relationship between cinema and psychoanalysis, that is, the interchange of images subsisting between oniric space and image space, with all the allegorical values and psychic consequences this interchange involves. The constellation of writings linked to the reflections on art, production techniques, beyond the political debate in which it arose, is today more interesting than ever for the numerous ideas it offers that move in multiple directions to decipher the new conditions of the production and reception of artistic communication in the present day. On the political value of Benjamin's reflections, there is no need to insist, because today, as never before, the political decision is linked to that transportability of the image through media, in which the processes of political persuasion pass for allegories and icons that play on suggestions of the imaginary rather than rational argumentation. Rather, it is worth reflecting on the bodily aspect of the images transmitted through artistic and non-artistic communication, which consists in the use of a mnemonic reservoir, partly deriving from the subjective and collective dream work, partly from advertising and from mass communication in general. The Freudian subtext to the essay on art, and more explicitly in the Arcade Project, is the most interesting element for understanding the material and bodily aspect of the images innervated in the corporeality of the individual, which allow us to bring back the filmic and communicative discourse to the problem of very close relevance of the relationship between subject and object, between the principle of reality and desire, between acceptance of what exists and strategies of change, albeit utopian, or the result of projections that characterize the era that is, quote, before our eyes, unquote.
Good afternoon. I would like to begin with a question, but don't worry, it will just be a silent reply. How many here have kept a diary? If you've kept a diary, just raise your hand.
For how long?
For any length of time.
The student of psychology.
So maybe about half? Yeah.
In a way, we were forced to keep a diary as part of our training in a teacher trainer course.
Yeah.
I don't know if that counts.
It counts.
It counts.
And how many have been in some form of analysis or psychotherapy? So about half. And how many have kept a diary of their psychotherapy or analysis? Just one. I put myself up to. So today, my presentation is about these intersections, and I begin with the question: what is a diary? In English, the term diary stems from the Latin diarium, or daily allowance. Its use is dated to the end of the 16th and beginning of the 17th centuries. The Oxford English Dictionary defines it as follows: a daily record of events or transactions, a journal, specifically a daily record of matters affecting the writer personally or which come under his personal observation. An example of a citation in 1605, Francis Bacon described a diary as follows: "Is a use well received and enterprises memorable, to keep diaries of that which passeth continually." My topic this afternoon points in two directions. First, where does the analytic diary as a literary genre fit within the history of diary writing in the 20th century? And I begin by saying, quite frankly, I don't know, but I'm interested in exploring this further. Second, analytic diary play in history of practice of psychotherapy. And here again, I don't know, but I have a few ideas on this score. Despite the importance, or what I claim to be the importance of analytic diaries, I've not found anything specifically in the literature written on the subject. It seems to me that in not a few cases, from my research as a historian, individuals undergoing psychotherapy spend more time writing in analytic diaries than actually seeing their therapists. And for many, this practice continued as a form of self-analytic activity long after the completion of psychotherapy. So one may pose the question, how much of the effect of the talking cure at a therapeutic level may have actually been due to such literary activities, to analytic diaries? So in this talk, I will use Jung and his patients as my example, simply due to the practicality of the archival material in my office. But I'd like to propose this as simply one example within a broader discussion in a comparative sense of the role of analytic diaries. I begin with Jung's own self-analytic procedure. From 1913 onwards, Jung was engaged in a self-investigation, which he recorded in a series of notebooks. In retrospect, he recalled, "Until 1900, I had kept a diary, and I thought that this would be a possibility for me to try to observe myself. This would be an attempt to meditate on myself, and I began to describe my inner states. These represented themselves to be in a literary metaphor. For example, I was in a desert and the sun shone unbearably. Sun equals consciousness." And this was the diary that Jung picked up again in 1913. It's interesting to note here that Jung's turned to use of the diary as the means for his new self-inquiry, for his new self-experimentation. Now, Jung was by no means the only psychologist to engage in such practice. Introspection was at this time one of the main methods in psychology. For example, Theodore Flanoir's diary in the 1890s includes notations of his dreams, childhood memories, and introspective analyses, alongside plans for psychological laboratory, drawing of equipment, and conversations with William James and Frederick Myers. Jung noted his self-experimentation in a series of notebooks which have come to be known as the Black Books. And these note his active imaginations, coupled with his reflections on his psychic states. The opening entries in the autumn of 1913 depict our address to his soul, and depict a movement of coming back to his soul after a period of a decade of estrangement. In several entries in 1913 and 14, he reflected on his activity. 15th November, he writes, "Why must I tell you all that, my soul? Why do you chain me to this book? And why do you drive my pen so furiously, as if it had to go a long way, and hurry to cover it?" On 28th November, he notes, "With inner resistance, I approach this book. I ceaselessly devalue it, yet something forces me to dive into it, actually into myself. Why? It seems to follow this way." Again, on 15th December 1913, he refers to the book as "book of my most difficult experiments. I open you with inner resistance." And on 24th May 1914, refers to it as follows: "Ha, this book. I've laid hands on you again, banal and pathological and frantic and divine, my written unconscious." And finally, on 13th January, he writes, "I kiss you, you book of light and love." The last entry specifically indicating the passage he travelled in the interim. Striking these quotes, Jung's relation to himself, his self-investigation, is also an exploration of his relation to the book, to the Black Book, in which he noted these dialogues and his self-encounter. For entries between 1913 and 1916 in these books, he composed the text of Liber Novus, adding a second layer of lyrical elaboration and commentary to the entries from 1913 to the middle of 1914, and transcribed these into a calligraphic volume which he illustrated with paintings. Now, in contrast to the Black Books, Liber Novus was addressed to a public and intended for publication, though itself never published during Jung's lifetime. As we'll see, both of these literary activities played a part also in his evolving analytic practice. So in what follows, I'll give examples from several of Jung's cases, arranged roughly chronologically. Around 1912, Tina Keller, the wife of the pastor Adolf Keller, came to see Jung for analysis. In retrospect, she wrote in her memoirs, "Dr. Jung insisted on preparation. We were taught to write out our dreams and associations to each of its elements. The most important technique I learned in the sessions with Dr. Jung was writing from the unconscious. Early in my analysis, Dr. Jung said, you must at once begin to prepare for the time you will no more be coming to me. Each time, as you're leaving, even as you're going downstairs, you have more questions. Write these down as if they were letters to me. You don't need to send these letters. When you ask a question, in the measure that you really want an answer, and you're not afraid of that answer, there is an answer deep inside you. Let it come up. I tried, nothing came. I told Dr. Jung. He insisted. He even said, surely you know how to pray. We see here Jung advocating the written recording of dreams and associations, which he would ask his patients to give him a copy, and also the proposition of writing letters addressed to him and not sending them. On the one hand, you can think this is a very canny technique for someone that has too much mail. In fact, I'm beginning to wonder if I should adopt it with my students and people that write me with email, saying, just don't press send, just imagine my reply, and that should be good enough. It might work. The letter diary then forms a means of continuing the work between the sessions and to enable the patient to utilize the figure of the doctor to dialogue with their own interior healer. While Tina Keller did not preserve her own letters, I've seen examples of others who did, which suggests that this was a practice that Jung suggested to others as well. Here are excerpts from a series of letters written by Gary de Angulo, later Baines. Again, these are letters addressed to Jung but not sent. But analysis with Jung in the early 1920s. September 21st, 1922. You asked me at the end of my hour if I had any dreams, and I said not many, and that I feared that it was going to be the same story of last winter, in my not being able to recover my dreams, and so not to get any nearer my, quote, unconscious. You looked at me and said, yes, it must be hard for you to get in touch with your unconscious. It's a case of not being able to see the wood for the trees. The problem is right at the end of your nose, and you can't see it. I've asked myself if you formulated my unconscious problem, and if so, can you not tell me what it seems to you to be, or must I first formulate it alone? You see that inner lucid expression of reflectively thinking, is he forcing her to formulate it herself in this letter form? September 25th, 1922. It's not true, as you said, that I've carried on my analysis with my intellect alone and have remained a masked figure to you. Certainly there is something about how my intellect works that you don't understand, but I will come back to that. What is true that I don't express my feelings for you, or rather sometimes I don't, far more often than I do. That comes not so much from the suppression as from the fact that I think of you as a symbol rather than as a person. Would you call this intellectualizing you? And would that be just further proof that I'm running along my major function? Doesn't seem to me that, because though I think of you as a symbol and not as a man, I think of you as an emotional symbol. Why isn't this the right way for me to think of you? The essential fact is that wandering about the universe, completely detached, I have met you and entered into an indissoluble union with you. It took place automatically and without any willing or not willing on my part, just on account of your being what you are. To this you I can write because this you gives me a place in your life. A neat place of great intimacy and yet extreme aloofness. That is the way I define a symbolical relationship. I'm at one at the same time inside your being forever and completely separated from you. Every hour I spend with you has holiness in it for me, not because I'm worshipping you, but because I'm reaching towards certain values which you express more completely than anyone else. So these excerpts illustrate the manner in which Gary de Angulo used these letters as a form of self-analytic activity to continue and reflect on the issues discussed in her sessions with Jung and to further explore her relation to what he symbolically stood for. The next patient I'd like to consider is Constance Long. I put a question mark there as I've still not found a photo of her, so if you do, please send it along. I have no idea what she looked like. Some sense of her character is given when she goes to see Jung in 1919. Ernest Jones writes to Freud, "Our member who goes to Jung is a woman, Constance Long, a virgin of 40, hence in any case not too hopeful." By contrast to Carrie Baines, in her diary, Constance Long recorded her dreams and discussions which took place in her sessions with Jung. Here's an example around 1920-21. Dream. I find myself in some Arctic or Antarctic region. It might almost be another planet. I'm in an awkward situation. Seems I've offered to go on to a further point, or else to go back. The place is looked after by a white man who is a trader connected with the firm for whom I make this journey. This is very vague. There are a number of savages clad in fur boots and garments. These people are dark brown and I do not like their looks. I'm suspicious of them. She then notes Jung's comments. Whether the dreams often foretell the goal and one should go that way. In psychoanalysis, you often see that the thing you are going to do is wrong, but it is the right way. Or you see the good, and it is not possible. You cannot reach it or you would die. The wrong way is sometimes more direct than the good way. He is pushed off from the direct way. What is the psychological case? You symbolize the way as a straight path which he can't travel. He goes to the right or the left. It is a typical situation. The wider the separation of the pairs of opposites, the more one-sided you become. And hence in the unconscious, also the pairs of opposites will split. The corresponding opposite is recommended. So you'll get a fresh neurosis or return of old neurosis. You feel the dissociation behind conscious and unconscious. He'll project it onto you. The more you proceed in the wrong direction, you paralyze the unconscious so you become speechless and lame and can't go on. Then you begin to regress, and the typical phenomena could be infantile fantasies, etc. So in these notations, it seems what she's trying to do is to record Jung's statements to be able to further meditate on them, to further take in the interpretations, to further reflect on them and embody them in her life. The next case is that of Christiana Morgan, who sees Jung in the mid-1920s. In her analysis with Jung, she practiced active imagination, which she further used as the basis for a seminar on the interpretation of visions in the 1930s. In her analysis diaries, she simply notes her dreams, active imaginations, and Jung's comments on them. In one entry, Christiana Morgan asked Jung about the value of active imaginations. Why are these more important than dreams? You say there is no solution, but I have to arbitrarily stop them because I get so tired. Jung. They are more than dreams because they represent a mixing and fusing of the conscious with the unconscious. This is the solution of the opposites. The middle way that all great philosophers have known. Through this you can find direction. You can find the way. Of course it tires you because you're doing a terrific piece of creative work. You're creating yourself by this. You're creating the moral solution for yourself. Go on just as you're going with your little band of animals and the Indian. Follow along with them, and soon they will bring you to the fitting form for your unconscious. She continues, I read a fantasy of my own face and the fish. Jung. I had such a fantasy. See that through the unconscious you are finding the spirit. The fish swims underwater and in the vision he meets your face in the air, which means the spirit. At the same time, Jung recommended that she painted her visions in a book akin to his own Liber Novus. And she notes Jung saying, I should advise you to put it all down as beautifully as you can in some beautifully bound book. will seem as if you are making the visions banal, then you will need to do that. Then you are freed from the power of them. If you do that with these eyes, for instance, they will cease to draw you. You should never try to make the visions come again. Think of it in your imagination and try to paint it. Then when these things are in some precious book, you can go to the book, turn over the pages, for it will be your church, your cathedral, the silent place of your spirit where you will find renewal. If anyone tells you that it is morbid and neurotic, and you listen to them, then you will lose your soul, for in that book is your soul. So we have, in a way, two activities. Christiane Morgan noting her dreams and analysis with you in her Analytic Diaries, and also composing this book in which she's painting, or a series of books in which she's painting her visions in the same manner that Jung did himself. The next patient or figure is John Layard, British anthropologist and analyst. As his biographer informed me, during the course of his life, he had 20 therapists, 20, including Wilhelm Steckel, H.G. Baines, Jung, more than once, and R.D. Laing. In Layard's notes, he at one point he drew a painting, and if you read the text, it indicates drawn after the announcement of the end of term by Jung. Where there's an ear, it has written no ear, and if you look closely again, it indicates stupid, brute, not seen, seen. Intellectual function. So evidently he's not too pleased at the end of term. I'm wondering if that's your situation today. Maybe not. No.
When was it?
1937. Layard noted his dreams with Jung, and then during his analysis with Jung, and then even prepared an index to this first page of the index. And then, intriguingly enough, when he returned to London, he had a second analysis, a third analysis with Baines, who he had an analysis with in 1926 and 36, and goes to have analysis with him again in 38, and sends him his dreams that he's had in his analysis with Jung, in which he then gets into criticism of Jung's interpretations. So this is an example. A letter to Baines in October 1938. I've been reading through my dreams during that fatal term with Jung, and find that the same night I had the vision I showed you about embracing Jung in front of the theatre stage, waiting for a play that never began. I had a long and detailed dream that Jung's brother was getting married to a very banal sort of girl, and that as the wedding party was about to enter Jung's house, in which I was, news came that Jung had shot his own brother. Jung refused to take this dream as in any way referring to him, and I accepted this dictum. The only thing I remembered is having extracted out of it was the warning that I must accept the banal side of myself. It's pretty clear in the light of our recent talks that the dream did in fact represent the marriage of Jung's shadow with a banal woman, that he himself had in fact, as far as I was concerned, shot his own shadow, which explains why he was unable to analyze me. I agree, of course, that I must also accept my banal side, but the trouble was that on this occasion Jung did not accept his. Layard went back to Jung, still seeking further analysis, but with Jung, and was over in Zurich in 1947. There he writes a letter. I've made no further progress with active imagination, and apparently I may not see you unless I do. It's like telling someone he mustn't bathe before he can swim. Do you want your work to live on in the written word only, or in flesh and blood? If the latter, and it's sad if they have to exclude one another, I wish you would concern yourself with me. So, in contrast to the earlier patients I indicated, who were open to Jung's offer, receptive and responsive to Jung's invitation, and took it on board in a transformative manner, Leonard was less receptive, though still seeking Jung's instruction. The next patient to consider is Esther Harding. Her voluminous diaries include several periods of analysis with Jung over several decades. In these, she notes her dreams, associations, together with Jung's comments. What is striking is these diaries continue in this way right throughout her life, noting dreams, associations, and her own interpretations. A further example is found in Hermann Hesse that Mauro mentioned, who after his analysis with Joseph Lang goes and has an analysis with Jung. And his dream diary is very interesting for noting dreams which follow his conversations with Jung, and also descriptions of some of his conversations with Jung during his analysis with Jung. So, to conclude, these examples have given, you could say, some sense of the different uses that patients of Jung have made of analytic diaries during their analyses with Jung. And indeed, how for some, this extended into a lifetime mode of notation, self-recording, or recording of the imaginal figures that appear to the self, and self-reflection. These diaries were also accompanied by letters, which forms an interesting comparative case to the correspondences that Rémy presented this morning. I think, in a way, as we were just discussing, one part of contrast is that these patients also wrote letters to themselves, in a way adopting analytical psychology as a worldview and a new form of life. So it was, in a way, the development also of a new social role and how to become, live a life in a symbolic way and embody this, and how to partake and present this to others, which often took the form of proselytizing and also forms of comparison. The formation of a micro-community, a sub-community, and analytic networks of patients, which, in my view, formed an important part in the development of these practices and how they came to occupy their place in society. So on the one hand, these analytic diaries, which form the silent, subterranean accompaniment to the practice of psychotherapy, would be interesting to compare with patients of other forms of psychotherapy. How did they differ? Or were they forms in similar? And what role did it ultimately play in the development of these therapeutic practices, or within these therapeutic practices? And second, does this have anything to do with a subjective, introspective turn in modernist diaries? Indeed, what has been called abstractly the subject. Maybe this is one small but not negligible aspect of a subjective term within the modernist period, and indeed within modernist literature. I say that with question marks because one is dealing with what is unpublished, but there is also a permeability between what is unpublished and what enters the public domain. So I thank you for your attention and even your silence, because silence is also an accompaniment to talking, hearing, and writing. There is also room for silence. Thank you.
deprive students of the possibility to ask questions. So I would wait another second. Not to intimidate them. No questions from you? Sure? Okay, my point is rather from the literary perspective. So I was very impressed by the page that you showed of Jung's diary, which seemed to me very neat. It was very clear. There was no sign of deletions, and so what I thought is, what kind of writing is this? Okay, is it? You talked in terms of self-analysis, self-investigation. So, what is the status of writing in this diary? Do we have to take it as a sort of automatic writing? I mean, without, or are there other examples of pages in the diary that appears that look like differently from the one that it is here? I mean, there are forms of modification or adjustments, cuts, or rewritings of things. This would connect with the issue of, as I was saying, the condition of writing of a diary in terms of a literary genre. Are we to consider this as a literary genre following a set of specific rules, standards, patterns?
It's very interesting questions. The work will be published next year, a facsimile edition. There's about 1,000 pages, and this is emblematic of the rest of the pages. And it's very clean, not only cleanly written, but lucid text. So the lucidity matches the clarity of the script. In that sense, it's not written automatically, but I would say it's written spontaneously, which I think is an important distinction here. There are active imaginations where Jung is finding himself the eye of the text in various scenes, locations, and entering into dialogue with the characters that emerge. So a question that I've been pondering now for many years is he visualizing something and then taking a subsequent notation, as in the form when you wake from a dream and you note it down? Or is this happening with a pen in his hand? It's a question that is ultimately undecidable because there's no clear statement to that effect. But I strongly veer to the latter, in the sense that there's a way in which you telescope time and event when you record a dream or record a conversation subsequently that you don't find here. So I think it's a spontaneous record that is happening literally with a pen in his hand. It's in that sense that the writing is integral to the elaboration of the work. So
there is no post-editing of this writing as you see it, right?
No, but there is post-editing when he comes to elaborate it in Liber Novus, when he takes a text from 1913 and 1914, which he then elaborates in a painstaking manner, when he becomes then what I call the editor of his own material. In terms of prototype, this is a wide question in the sense of you have to then look back at issues such as spiritual diaries. You have, for instance, the diary of Swedenborg, to take just one example that comes to mind. And where then does, for instance, the analytic diary fit within that longer trajectory or a genealogy of the analytic diary are questions that one could pose. And I think are worth posing. And also to note that there's, in a way, a subgenre which it links up to, which is that of the dream diary. Dream diaries clearly predate these practices, and also post-date these practices.
Jelena and DeSantis destroyed the clinical material. In your opinion, why Jung did store the diaries and did not destroy the diaries and clinical material?
Well, he didn't keep his clinical material. He kept his own material, in the sense that the other materials I've cited were usually from private archives and kept by the individuals themselves. I think with Jung's own material, he felt that this was the records of a self-experimentation that had import not just for himself, on the one hand, and also due to the value of the material. If a book is your soul, if you destroy that book, you lose your soul. You want it kept safe.
Jelena destroyed his soul.
Or lost its double.
Thinking of the portrait of Dorian Gray.
I was really struck by this relationship he seems to maintain with his diary. It's like a diary as a double somehow. Well, just from what you've read, it's almost like as if he's looking forward to have this privileged moment. As the diary, so I was wondering if he ever wrote a specific time that he wrote, or if you can imagine that he wrote it before he went to bed or after consultation, or can we suppose that he might have done this regularly at a specific moment so that we understand a bit more, or what his motivation could have been? Or is it just, you find just a date and that's it?
But one entry that I think at one point his soul recommends, in a way, you dedicate the day to the things of the world and reserve the evenings for the soul. And my supposition is, Jung at this time is maintaining a full therapeutic practice, full professional activities. He's head of the Association of Analytical Psychology, which is meeting fortnightly. He's engaging in the field of psychology. And my sense is he would, in a way, return to his library after dinner.
I was wondering if we, at the end of your presentation, if we think of all the interest at that time, I mean, in the late 90s, about the practice of writing, about how writing is a way to explore the mind. One question that we can ask to ourselves as historians is, to what extent the role of the talking part of psychotherapy has not been overestimated. Maybe you have to reconsider how writing was a practice which was very important to describe, to explore the mind, and also to act on the mind. And maybe it was a tour de force from Freud to talk, to present this as a talking cure when it was a writing cure.
I agree in the sense that I think it was an essential support. I think sometimes one is also in a context where you don't state something because it's obvious. In the sense, if you're in a culture where correspondence and notation in diaries is what everyone is doing in some form, you don't state it because it's everywhere. It's presupposed. I think that is one element. But I do think that there is a point of, again, you have Freud's periodic destructions of his own materials, in the sense how would the evolution of psychoanalysis seem if he had kept his materials, or you have the very odd excerpts of materials that survived, such as in the case of patient that he called the Ratman. But I think beyond that, I do think that there is a significance that was also obscured in a way that is quite curious, and that has also not been given enough attention to by historians. In the sense, in a way, if you ask elementary questions, what do people do in these contexts? You need to link it in a slightly associative way. I've often wondered in the case of Lacan, they may have had short sessions, but they were probably waiting a long time in the waiting room having psychotherapy with the other patients and discussing things amongst themselves. So there are other less visible parts of practices that in a way form part of the culture and support of these practices and the milieu.
Just a simple curiosity. We know that at the end of the Liber Novus there is an entry by Jung written many years after the original. Is there something like that on the Black Book as well?
No, the material which I'll publish comes to an end in 1932, when that's the end of this phase of self-investigation. And as Jung later puts it, his confrontation with the unconscious drew to a close, and his confrontation with the world began. So it is a reorientation, a return from the underworld. And you find that cited, or echoed in his citation from the Ennead in his presentation in, I think, 1936 on alchemy at the Erasmus conference. In a way, a repost Freud's citation from the Ennead in Interpretation of Dreams, where Jung was in fact saying, or citing the station, to go down is easy, but to come back, that's the real task. In a way, how the attempt to translate his insights into a language acceptable to a medico-scientific audience.
Questions? Are you sure?
Okay.